All I
Hey
can see is my
everyone.
talk.
What'd you say?
All
Okay.
I can see is my talk. Is that good?
Yeah, that's fine. Hey
Okay.
everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. Well, today is the second Sunday of the month, which means it's time for Nutrition Insights with Dr. Peter Rogers. And today he's going to be talking about the Spartan vegan diet for beginners. Please welcome him back. I see you have a new look, and I think it looks great.
Yeah, well, thank you. A couple things here. I realize for the audience that probably not seen me looking like this before, I can tell you my old family nickname was Stanchik, and it's a little bit of a, five insults in one. He was the court jester, ambassador to Poland, and he was sort of a real serious guy, and they called him a party pooper. Everyone's having fun, drinking and everything, and he's worried about, the papers on the desk. They'd lost a battle in Smolensk. So anyways, that was how my family would tease me. My wife, she's not going to win an argument with me on logic, but just call me names and she'll win the vast majority of them. So anyways, now I got this haircut, and so my wife, what she calls me, she says, "You look like a little Kojak." And I don't look like him at all. Do you think? So the other thing, the rest of the family's a bunch of meat eaters, so they're a little bit fat, which means they got more blubber to insulate them. So they like the thermometer of the house kind of cold. So I'm always wearing a sweat jacket, and a lot of times I have the hood on. So then my wife, if I'm wearing the hood and the sweat jacket, she calls me a Teletubby. But anyways. Okay, I just want to briefly, one thing I forgot to mention last time, we were talking about EMF, electromagnetic fields, and how you can EMF shield and whatnot. And I was going to show you my magic no EMF bed. And just to get a sense of it, here's a mirror above the bed. If you have the mirror facing the bed, it's because you want to watch the theatrics going on down there. But, you're old like me, you turn it around and it faces the other way. And then there's mirrors in the room, kind of like a ballet school room, but I have them around the bed facing outward. Okay, so then this is what's called a Faraday tent, and you can ground it or unground it. I bought a tri-field meter. Here's actually what the whole setup looks like. Mirrors going externally around the bed, above it, and on the ground to sort of shield the whole thing. And I got a tri-field EMF meter, and I measured the EMF inside it. It's like 0 compared to everywhere else. It's the lowest by far. So anyways, for what that's worth, that's one way you could do it for EMF shielding. Okay, now for today's talk. The Spartan vegan diet. And this name Spartan comes out of it being real cheap and simple. Anybody could understand it. Anybody could do it. Also, my background is a wrestler, and I admired a lot of these wrestler guys who I trained with and knew in college. They were All-Americans, national champions, world champions. And I'll just mention one guy to you by the name of John Smith. He decided that he could perform better if he was real simple, just lived in a small apartment. He had a really low budget. He became 6-time world champion. And the reason I say that is there's a strength that comes from simplicity. You simplify your life as much as you can and just focus on what you want to focus on and not waste time, not be distracted. That's how you get energy. When you know what you want to do, your conscious mind, subconscious mind are committed to it, and you focus all your energy on it. That's how you achieve a lot in a particular area. Okay, so anyways, what it all kind of comes down to as far as health is this is you at the beginning of the map. You are here. And to live a good, long, healthy life, your best chance, is, of course, we talked about low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet. We'll talk more about the details of that. Also, you got to avoid toxins. There's a lot of toxic things in the environment and different types of processed food and whatnot you want to avoid. And basically, you go down this route, you got a good chance to keep the Johnson working well into old age and not need to take any pills or surgery. By the way, I'm 60. I don't take any pills or I've never had a surgery in my life. I don't intend to. And then you probably live to an average of about 90 years of age, maybe even older than that. Okay, if you go down this path, eating the meat, the oil, the processed food, like the vast majority of people do, you're going to end up on a bunch of pills, drug. Then the pills fail worse and worse. Then you go for surgery, chop. Bye money. Okay, it's not a smart path to take, and that's what most people do. Okay, here is Cicero, greatest of Romans, and one of his quotes here was, my favorite quote from Cicero, "To not know what happened before you were born is to forever remain a child." And it kind of goes with Aristotle quote. If you want to understand something, see how it was made. And what I'm getting at is look at epidemiology. Because what a lot of people tell me is, oh, they can't understand nutrition. There's too much contradictory information on the internet. And I would say if you look at the epidemiology, there's really, I don't see the contradictory information. These two populations were the Tarahumara, which sort of means fleet of foot runner, in northern Mexico. They live especially in this area called Sierra Madre Mountains, Copper Canyon area. And they were combined with this population called the Pima. After the Mexican-American War, the Pima were absorbed into Arizona after 1848, and they now eat the Americanized, standard American diet, SAD diet, okay? Here's a picture of the Pima back in the 1800s. They're all real fit and athletic looking. They look like a college wrestling team, okay? If you look at pictures of them now, just go on the internet, type in your browser, Pima obesity or something. You'll see all these really fat people with tons of medical problems. They do tons of gallbladder surgery over there. Okay, so anyways, what I'm saying is, genetically, this was the same population, but the population that's now taking on the standard American diet, they're famous for being very sick, very overweight. Cabbage means coronary artery bypass grafts, open heart surgery for coronary artery disease. Excuse me, sigmoid colon resection for diverticulitis. BKA is below-knee amputation for diabetes, typically. So anyways, terrible health. On the other hand, the Tarahumara fleet of foot runners, they're world famous for being ultramarathoners. They have a holiday where every guy in town, not just a fast guy, runs 100 miles in 2 days. Nathan Pritikin was so impressed by the Tarahumara, he patterned his diet after them. They especially eat a lot of corn, beans, squash. Rarely they'll eat a little bit of meat. They don't have any obesity. Their average cholesterol is 136. One thing I would say about them, people sometimes say to me, well, what about in the real world, people aren't 100% vegan? And I would say, yeah, that's true. All of these populations, ate a tiny bit of meat, but they had been that way their whole lives. I think the regular American person ate a pretty lousy diet. In a sense, they have to detoxify their body, if you will, and they have accumulated atherosclerosis. We'll talk about that some more, but what I'm basically saying is, if you've eaten a westernized high-fat diet, high-sodium diet, and for all these years in processed food, you've got atherosclerosis. You don't need a cardiac CT scan of your chest to see it. You've got it. Okay, forget about it. You have it. What you need to do is start reversing it and start and make sure it doesn't progress. Okay, and I'm just going to show you a couple quick stories of epidemiology, and there's tons of them. Okay, in Finland, they had tons of super high rate of coronary artery disease and death from myocardial infarction. And there was a physician there who kind of led the project. His name was Pekka Puska. Karelia is like a province in Finland. And once they stopped tobacco, they decreased their saturated fat intake by avoiding meat and dairy, decreased their sodium intake. They actually switched from sodium to like potassium chloride in their salt shakers, and they taught the wives, because typically the guys were out like lumberjacks and stuff working. They taught them about cooking. They had an 84% reduction in cardiovascular mortality. That's incredible numbers, okay? The other observation, like in Norway and other countries, was, after World War II, during World War II, when there was rationing and they had a decline in the meat and the oils and whatnot that was available to them, they had a dramatic reduction in coronary artery disease, diabetes, autoimmune disease, okay? So even though they were psychologically, obviously very stressed out in that time, the effect of the diet was more powerful than the effect of the psychological stress. Here's just two major patterns of atherosclerosis. There's a standard westernized pattern. It first most severely presents like in the coronary artery disease, proximal coronary arteries at bifurcations. Also presents early in the carotid artery at bifurcations. We're going to come back to this issue of bifurcations. The high blood pressure, hypertension bounces off the median divider. This is the external carotid, goes up to the face. Here's the internal carotid artery, goes up to the brain. Okay, and you'll always see atherosclerosis. I look at cerebral arteriograms every day, and I can tell you that's where it happens. Okay, and so this is sort of Westerner pattern of atherosclerosis, coronaries and carotids. This is the East Asian pattern, like the Japanese pattern. Going back to the 1960s, they were eating tons of sodium, like 12, 14 grams a day, and they're also smoking a lot of cigarettes, and they produced a lot of hypertension, so they had a very high stroke rate. Other than that, they were relatively healthy. They also compensated by eating a very low-fat diet, because they're eating rice, 1% fat, and they were also eating a pretty decent number of vegetables. Okay, you can see a pattern in the Japanese, old school Japanese. They would migrate to Hawaii, start becoming more westernized, start getting fatter and sicker. Then when they migrate to California, eating, again, more and more of a westernized diet, high in fat, high in oils, and they would just keep getting fatter and sicker. By the way, here's Okinawa. Okinawa is sort of like what Hawaii is to America. That's kind of like what Okinawa is to Japan. And the Okinawans were the healthiest of the Japanese. They ate a much less sodium than the rest of Japan. That's thought to be probably the reason why they had such an advantage in health over the rest of Japan, even though the rest of Japan was pretty healthy too. Longest lived people ever were the Loma Linda Seventh-day Adventists. And they had an average lifespan, the ones that were vegan, of the women living about 88.6 years and the men about 85.3 years. And Dr. McDougall had worked in that population, and he also said they weren't as healthy as you think, in the sense that they were sort of like religious vegans, because it's part of their religion. Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen White, the founder, said animal foods are bad, but they weren't necessarily as low in fat as one might potentially be able to be, or were they, as low in sodium as they might potentially be able to be. But anyways, that's kind of interesting, those numbers. They were living about 10 years longer than the average Californian, or a little more than that. Plus, they have a longer so-called health span, or they're healthy before, their final time, so to speak. And I made this joke before. I don't know if you heard me. It's from the movie Colors. It's with regard to, there's two bulls up on a hill, okay? And there's a bunch of cows down in the field below. And the young bull says to the old bull, hey, look at all those cows down there. Let's run down there and we'll have sex with those cows. And with sex with one of those cows. And the old bull says, why don't we just walk down there and have sex with all of them? Okay, and so what am I getting at is, in playing the game of health and trying to win the game of health, you could do something similar. Okay, the reason why the low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet is so powerful is it's a species-specific diet that prevents most diseases. We just talked a little bit about, the standard American diet being real high in fat and moderately high in oil and sodium. And it produces tons of coronary artery disease and a pretty good amount of diabetes, hypertension, lots of impotence, a lot of cancer, a lot of dementia. Okay, East Asian Japanese diet, they uniquely were high in sodium and tobacco, and that was what their problem was. But other than that, they're pretty healthy. They're compensating, like I said, being low in fat and having the moderate amount of vegetables. Still had lots of strokes and hypertension and problems from that. South Asian, like in India, I always thought India people as being so healthy, because I know lots of Indian doctors, okay, and they're skinny and they'll say they're vegetarian. They look pretty healthy. But it turns out, as I got to know them better and I learned more about the history of health in India, they got a lot of diabetes and a lot of coronary artery disease. And I couldn't understand why. I go, oh, you're vegetarian. Now, I realize they eat some fat in the form of, the ghee, like the butter. But what it turns out appears to be the cause is they eat tons of fried food. And this reminds me, too, of the research of Tetsumori Yamashima, the Japanese guy. He was given the task, this Japanese physician, I think he's an MD, PhD, to figure out why is the incidence of dementia increasing so much in Japan. And he came to the conclusion it's because they're eating tons more omega-6 cooking oils. And he believes that's leading to lipid peroxidation, and that's causing something similar to ferroptosis, the death of both hypothalamus brain cells, increasing their hunger, and pancreas beta cells, the insulin producers in the pancreas. When you damage the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus in the brain, that's the hunger center. You have less ability to control hunger. So anyways, it also was causing a loss of hippocampal neurons, memory center neurons. So that was his conclusion. That's called the Cathepsin-Cass-based theory of neurodegeneration related to cooking oils. That's Tetsumori Yamashima. Okay, so anyways, low-fat, low-sodium vegan. Look at this. Very low, next to zero, diabetes, hypertension, myocardial infarction, very low in stroke, impotence. You can still get cancer, because cancer is caused by a lot of different things, and there are genetic components, vulnerabilities to cancer, but it's much, much lower in these populations. And it was Dr. T. Colin Campbell wrote a lot about this when he studied China. They had a markedly reduced incidence of cancer. Okay, and I was also going to tell you is conventional medicine, they're not going to be able to help with these chronic diseases. They don't have treatments for them. You come to Chef AJ's site, it's like the School of Athens. You can get all these lectures, all this information, and it's free, okay? And I kind of laugh, too. If you go to dietitian school, I know a bunch of dietitians, and some of them are real good, but a lot of them, they have industry funding their school, and it teaches them, industry teaches them, all the stuff, you've heard all the stuff on the internet, that high fructose corn syrup's okay, and all this other stuff. I'm not going to get into it, but I'm just telling you, here it's free, okay? It's right free. Just watch the videos. All right. Here is the whole story on nitrates. Basically, when you eat the greens, and Nathan Bryan, the expert on nitric oxide, and Caldwell Esselstyn also both taught us a lot about nitric oxide. You eat the greens, the bacteria on the back of your tongue convert the nitrate. It comes in as NO3. The tongue converts it to nitrite. So that should be a letter I there, NO2. And then the acid in your stomach facilitates the conversion of it to nitric oxide, NO. That's absorbed in your blood. I actually think it travels on the RBCs, but it's able to travel around your body systemically and open up your arteries, okay? And I think that's why you feel good when you walk out in the sun you get this vasodilatation. Well, actually, walking out in the sun, what's that about? You've got precursors to nitric oxide in your skin. And so when you walk out in the sun, it activates them too. That's another reason why it's good to get your sunshine. And yeah, you got to be careful about, I don't use mouthwash. I don't even brush my teeth. Maybe about, once every 2 weeks or something. I just don't eat anything that's going to cause cavities. I rinse them off and I floss. You always want to floss at night because you don't make much saliva at night while you're sleeping. That puts you at risk for cavities. That's why you want to floss and use those interdental brushes before you go to bed. But it also shows the risk of certain things, like you take a PPI, proton pump inhibitor, and it blocks your stomach acid. You're going to have trouble with this last step of the conversion. You're going to decrease your systemic nitric oxide, and it becomes a significant amount as you get older. I think I saw a Nathan Bryan slide saying as a person gets older, I forget the exact age, let's say 70, it's like 50% in your nitric oxide, he claims. I think some of that, though, is based on American data where they expect people to have a lot of atherosclerosis and eat a lousy diet. And I'll bet you it's not that bad if people don't do that, because you look at these countries where they don't do that, where they eat the plant-based diet all their life, they don't have any hypertension in their 70s. Okay, Tarahumara, Yanomamo, etc. Okay, here's the Spartan vegan food pyramid. At the bottom is all this social stuff, trying to get along with your family and friends, have good relationships, avoid unnecessary stress, get your exercise, get your sleep, get your sunshine. And, people joke about religion, but I'll tell you something, religious people are way healthier. There's entire books about that. Okay, starches. Starches, are basically a polymer of glucose wrapped in fiber. And what's so great about starches it's like the best food in the world. I'll tell you why, because your stomach is stretched by the low caloric density. And that's because there's all this fiber. There's a lot of fiber in plant foods. And they're think of them as being wrapped around the glucose. And then what happens is you get early satisfaction of hunger because of the stretching of the stomach. Then it goes into your small bowel, and it takes a lot of time for the enzymes to peel the fiber off before the glucose is absorbed into your blood. You get this slow increase in blood glucose. So it doesn't peak that high, and it just stays normal for a prolonged amount of time in the zone, so you feel good. Okay, so you get prolonged satisfaction of hunger. And probably like the most prolonged satisfaction of hunger comes from beans because there's so much fiber. They even call it the second meal effect. For example, I eat the OMAD diet. That means 1 meal a day diet. I eat an OMAD version of the Spartan diet. And I'm fine. People say, oh, aren't you hungry? No, I'm perfectly fine. And I've looked at graphs of liver glycogen and liver's ability to maintain blood glucose. It can handle it just fine, easily for 24 hours. It can handle it for 48 hours. So what I'm saying is, if it can handle it for 48 hours, 24 is nothing. I do it every day. No problem. Veggies are good, especially for veggies. You get your greens, you get your magnesium, you get your nitrates. The only thing we don't get as much of as we'd like would be vitamin B12, which comes from bacteria, actually. Animals tend to have more of it stored, so you eat animal food, you get it from them. But a lot of people who eat animal food, they need to take B12 too. So the only thing I take is a methylcobalamin. I don't like cyano because you know what cyano means, and I don't want anything that the word cyano in it. But this works, okay? And the other thing you're going to hear a lot of people say, well, you need to get more protein. Old people get sarcopenia. They're too weak if they don't eat more protein. That's BS. I'll just tell you a quick story. I sometimes lift weights with some young guys, and I hurt my shoulder as a wrestler in college, so I can't do bench press, okay, because it bothers my shoulder. And so they're making fun of me. Look at your chest development, you look weak, you're old, you're weak, and all this crap. And I said, well, you know what? I can still do push-ups, okay? And so at that time, I could do 48 push-ups, all right? But I've actually, because I was pissed off at them making fun of me, I developed a routine to get better at push-ups. I did 76 push-ups, okay? So whenever I see these young guys and they give me any flack, I just say, you know what? 76 push-ups, because they can only do, like, the strongest of those guys can only do, one can do 46, another can do 52. So what I'm trying to say is I'm 60 years old, all right? You don't need more protein. All these, blue zones and all these other people living in these rural places, they don't take protein supplements. They don't take any type of pill. So what I'm just trying to say is you can be plenty strong with that routine, okay? I can run up 5 flights of stairs like real quick, 50 flight. Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't count the stairs. What is it? To I can run up to the top of a pretty high apartment building real fast. I do it all the time. All right. So anyways, let's see what else. Fruits are great, but the problem with fruits is they're expensive and they don't tend to store as well. If you freeze them, then they'll tend to store better, obviously. You got to be a little careful with bananas because they're real sweet. You can get a rebound hypoglycemia, but you tend to get rebound hypoglycemia more so from if you have a liquid sweetened beverage. What else can we say about these? Potatoes, sweet potatoes, and rice are all 1% fat. 1% fat. The lower the percentage of fat within the diet, the skinnier the population will be. Okay, so, like you said, before 1970, China, 1 billion out of 1 billion rice eaters are skinny. It makes people skinny. When I lived in California, I never saw a single overweight Asian person, not a single one. And they were eating rice. I had a friend, I was a guy on the wrestling team, and he would eat rice 3 times a day. It's almost like water. All right. Now, if you look at beans, lentils have the lowest fat. They're like 3% fat. And they taste great. And there's a whole bunch of different types of lentils. Black beans are in the ballpark of 4% fat. Garbanzos are fatter. Garbanzo beans are about 13% fat, which is still not bad. Oatmeal is about 16% fat. Quinoa is something similar. I don't know, is in the ballpark of 15% fat. Soybeans are real fat. They're like 37%. I'm not a fan of soybeans, even though I know that's a real popular commercial item. Okay, but anyways, I'm just giving you a sense. If you're eating potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice, and beans, you're eating a very, very low-fat diet. Also, I actually think sweet potatoes are probably the healthiest food in the world. They're low in protein. Sweet potatoes are only about 4.5% protein. That's what you want, because typically the Americans always want the wrong thing. They think they need more protein. They want to take more calcium. That's a mistake. Okay. The high protein has all kinds of problems, activation of mTOR, etc. It's very overrated. All right. And you think about it, a newborn baby eating breast milk has 5 to 6% protein. And that's the most rapid rate of growth ever in the person's life. All right. And animal protein is different than plant protein. Animal protein has more leucine, which is a branched chain amino acid, and more methionine. Animal foods often contain iron in them, like especially red meat, for example. What's the point of all that? Plus the saturated fat. All of those things, they activate mTOR. mTOR is mammalian target of rapamycin. mTOR is like a contractor getting ready to build a building. Contractor says, I got to get all my materials, then I will build the building. And so mTOR, it's waiting for leucine, it's waiting for methionine, it's waiting to have an adequate amount of saturated fat, and it's also waiting to have an adequate amount of iron. So when you eat all those things, you're activating mTOR, which determines when a cell replicates. Okay, you don't want to speed up cell replication because there's something called a Hayflick limit. Hayflick was a microbiologist working with human tissue cultures, and he found that they can only divide 60 to 70 times. So that's talking about non-stem cells, non-germ cells. Germ cells is like your ovaries and your testicles, okay? Stem cells there's certain cells that are allowed to keep dividing, let's say, at the base of the intestinal tract to replenish other cells. But in general, most of the cells in your body, standard somatic means body, cells, they can only divide 60 to 70 times. So if you accelerate the rate at which they're dividing, you are accelerating aging. And things that tend to promote activation of mTOR, they also tend to accelerate cancer growth. So you don't want to be activating mTOR. If you're 20 years old and you're a bodybuilder trying to grow your muscles real fast, you might want to activate mTOR a little bit to try to win the Mr. Olympia contest. But after 30, you don't want to accelerate aging. You want to look young for your age, okay? So you don't want that. It's good to be low protein. There was also a guy by the name of James Mitchell. He was a Harvard researcher, and all his research showed decrease in protein intake dramatically, slowed aging in mice, for example. The other thing you're going to hear about, well, what about calorie restriction? What about fasting? If you eat the starch-based diet, you'll eat fewer calories. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of debate about that, and we can get into some details. But what I'm trying to say is the reason I think you'll eat less calories overall is because you're going to be skinny. All right? Because I know if you have 2 people the same size weight, they don't necessarily eat that much lower calories, but you will be the skinnier version of yourself, okay? And because of that, you'll eat less calories. So what I'm saying is the pleasant way to restrict calories is just eat a plant-based diet. You don't have to starve yourself. You don't have to do anything unpleasant. And, people talk about how great fasting is. Well, the issue with fasting, don't get me wrong, I know there's a lot of reasons why fasting can be really helpful. It can help you to break bad habits, all of that stuff. But what I'm saying is sooner or later, you have to eat. So when you eat stuff that's good for you. Okay, and just the last thing about fruits. If you've got a lot of access to them, they can be pretty healthy. I've seen a lot of people eat a lot of fruits, be pretty healthy. There's a guy by the name of Michael Arnstein. He's an ultra marathon runner. He moved to Hawaii, so he had more access to fruits all year round. Okay, now that would be great. If you've got the resources, you could move to Hawaii and do that. But for most of us, we're stuck where we're at, and you go to the store and you just have an option of what's there. In a perfect world, you would grow them on your own and all that, but that's not so easy to do. As far as veggies, there's a lot of different types. Esselstyn can rattle off, 10 different types, but just eat some type of salad every day, at least one. And so what I'm also trying to say, what are Americans deficient in? They're deficient in fiber, and that's a big deal because they don't eat plant foods. They're deficient in potassium. Why? P for plants, P for fiber, and that's super important to get. Number 3, they're deficient in magnesium. Why? Because it also comes from plants. Number 4, they're deficient in nitrates. Why? Because they come from plants, and you need those things. So those are the real deficiencies to be worried about. I'm not a believer in this, I need more calcium. I think that's stupid. The women who were taking over 1,400 milligrams of calcium per day, they had, I think it was like a 2.5 increased risk of death from myocardial infarction. I think it transiently bumps up the calcium in their blood, and it's prothrombotic. It's like a clotting factor for the blood, but by the time you take them for a blood draw, that calcium could have been removed from the blood. So you don't necessarily see it on that lab, but not a good idea. The protein, not a good idea. And I don't believe in this good fats. That's a whole other topic. But what I'm trying to say is I want to be skinny. I want to eat a low-fat diet. Okay, here's, putting the same Spartan vegan diet onto a plate. Now, how much starches should you eat? I would say in the ballpark of 50 to 90%. Now, I know Dr. McDougall pushes starches really heavy, and he's looked at all these Asian people eating the 85, even more, 90+% of starch. Okay, and you could do that, and that makes sense. He kind of leans towards only 1 to 3 servings of fruits per day. He's afraid that if people eat too much of them, you can get addicted to fruits. They taste so good, they're sweet. You might overdo it on that. But on a lot of people also, they'll eat more. I probably eat them, in the ballpark of 30 to 40% of my calories from fruits, and it's been working out pretty fine for me. And I know last time I talked to Chef AJ, she can tell you herself, but I think she was somewhere in the middle about where McDougall and myself were in terms of how much fruit she consumed. Everybody can work that out for themselves. We're not going to get into the subtle details of that. And then, vegetables are good. For me, it's a little bit more challenging to get vegetables just based on how my life is and my options. But I do try to make sure I have at least 1 salad every day, 2 on the weekends. You want to filter your water. We'll talk about that more later, but there are very good reasons why, at a minimum, you want a carbon water filter. Because if you don't, you're going to get all these estrogenic chemicals. Estrogen is a fat storage hormone. They're going to predispose you to gain weight. You're going to be frustrated. How come I can't lose weight? I'm eating perfect. And I think a lot of times that's the answer right there. Okay, so what's so good about the Spartan diet? It's cheap, so you save money. Starches are relatively cheap. Fruits are more expensive, though. As far as cooking, anyone could do it. All you do is boil water. You can just throw it in a pressure cooker like an Instapot, which has got stainless steel. It's better to cook on stainless steel. I don't like these no-stick cookware. I don't think you should ever use them. They're POFAs, and they put F- potentially into your food. Not healthy. I don't recommend them. Satisfying your hunger is the key issue. Good to experiment with it for a little while. And the key is to find a starch that you like, or a combination of starches. For variety, you can vary the amount of rice, the amount of beans, the amount of potatoes, sweet potatoes, regular potatoes, etc. Oatmeals, quinoa. You can have carrots too. I don't like carrots, even though carrots I think are real healthy food. They're kind of a starch. When you chew them, I got like an amalgam filling. I don't, they're kind of rough on the amalgam filling, so that's why I don't like hard chewing stuff. Let's see what else here. Common questions. We talked about protein. Yeah, whenever I see the young weightlifter guy and he gives me any crap, I just go 70, I do 76 now. 76 push-ups, because I know he can't do it. So you don't give me any more crap. Because other than that, he's stronger than me. Let's see. Spartan diet. Also there's the Bantus. The Bantus are in South Africa, this population where the women would have like 10 children, and they would get like only the amount of calcium in 1 little tiny cup of milk a day, much less than like westernized women. But the point I'm laughing about is they didn't have any problem with osteoporosis. So it's not like some magic solution. A bone is made out of lots of things besides calcium. And we got tons of calcium in our blood and our extracellular matrix. So it's not an issue. Osteoporosis is not like just a simple calcium issue. What are forbidden foods? What is forbidden? No oils, of course. I agree with the Esselstyn mantra. No oils, not 1 drop. Okay. Caffeine. I recommend no caffeine. I know you're going to hear all kinds of stuff about caffeine being healthy. Coffee is good for you. I think that's all BS, just so you know. I've read about it rather extensively. Stress increases cortisol, stress hormone, and the catecholamines, adrenaline and noradrenaline, okay, for fight or flight. And the point I'm saying is caffeine does the exact same hormones. So it's like schizophrenic to say, well, stress is bad, excessive stress is bad, but caffeine is good. BS, okay? And then the other selling point, they're going to go, well, coffee has lots of antioxidants. Yeah, right. Okay, it's a little tiny amount of what's put in there, but there's plenty of caffeine. In my opinion, you don't want that caffeine. It's an excitotoxin in the brain, increases glutamate transmission across your hippocampal neurons, while it simultaneously is it's a vasoconstrictor to the cerebral cortex. It constricts the diameter of the arteries. You don't want that. Decreased arterial blood flow with simultaneous increased metabolic activity of your neuron. You're going to get the gap widened between metabolic rate of a neuron and oxygen and glucose delivery. I'll talk about that more later in the talk. I've talked about that plenty in my other lectures, like my last 2 lectures with Chef AJ, but I'm just saying to you, you don't want that. Okay. That's actually the Peter Rogers, MD, theory of neurodegeneration, of neurovascular uncoupling. Metabolic rate of a neuron and oxygen glucose delivery. The wider that gap, those neurons eventually start dying. They go into apoptosis, which is programmed cell death, a gradual cell death whereby their contents are recycled, as opposed to rapid death, which would be necrosis, where just the cell lyses. You don't want that. So the things that potentially worsen that, also this MSG stuff. MSG is monosodium glutamate, which is the sodium salt of glutamate. You know, glutamate's an amino acid. It's also a neurotransmitter. Approximately 90% of the neurotransmitters in the brain are due to glutamate. I'm currently reading a book right now, Glutamate, Sculptor and Destroyer. The author's name is Matt Matson. He's spent his whole life doing research on glutamate. So it's kind of a fun book to read as far as that's concerned. But, and I'll actually mention one more thing about that book later in this talk. But the point I'm saying is, before I used to think 70% of the brain neurotransmitters were glutamate. It's 90%, okay? So you potentially increase activation of your brain neurons a little bit. Now they're going to say, oh no, the blood-brain barrier prevents that. Well, little kids don't have much of a blood-brain barrier. Plus the circumventricular organs around the third ventricle in the brain, they don't have a blood-brain barrier all through your life. The pineal gland doesn't have much of a blood-brain barrier. The area postrema vomiting center, it's a chemo center. It doesn't have much. And there's a few other of them. Plus lots of people have diabetes, hypertension, post-traumatic, post-stroke, spots of injury in their brain where they don't have an intact blood-brain barrier. Plus, you can overwhelm it with a rapid high concentration of MSG. So for all these reasons, I like to avoid all this stuff. Aspartame is something similar because aspartate, the amino acid, it comes off aspartame. That's also an excitatory neurotransmitter. All right. Stevia, it worsens the risk of infertility. Alcohol is all bad. It's a pure brain poison. Okay. Alcohol's for chumps. There's nothing good about it. That 1 or 2 drinks a day stuff is all turned out to be BS. So forget about it. We're not going to go into more detail, but trust me, it's for chumps. It's bad for your brain. Now nuts is controversial. I know there's a lot of popular press on it, especially recently. Corporations always take a profitable product and they give it what I would call like a bodyguard of lies and do all this commercial funded research to make stuff look good. Okay. I would recommend avoiding it. Okay. I think I would go with Esselstyn's point of view. No nuts. Okay. Seeds, that's a whole other topic. I don't pursue any of those, even though that's like, give an entire talk on that. Okay. I'm not a fan of it, but I know that's a popular topic. Avocados, I would stay away from them because they're getting sprayed with that coating that's rather toxic, in my opinion. We've talked about that in previous lectures. Apples apparently have a tendency to be getting that same coating, so I would avoid them now, even though I previously used to eat them. Okay, what else about Spartan vegan diet can we say? Oh, like I said, super easy. All you got to do is know how to do is boil water. You get used to it. Some people say, oh, well, that's so boring. I would die of boredom. Okay. Well, you get used to it. All I can say is you like it. I like it. I don't want to change. It's not because a lot of people, they have this idea, oh, well, I'm missing out on life. Now that I'm old and I'm fat, I'm going to be stuck to eat this miserable diet. Oh, it's wrong. I wish I could enjoy life like I used to. And you know what? I'll be like at a party or something. People say, well, don't you want some cake and some pizza and some beer? I'll say, no, no, thank you. And they go, oh, you're missing out on life. I'm like, yeah, right. What's going through my mind? I don't say it, but it's like, I want to eat something that's going to make me fat, sick, and stupid. No, I like being skinny and strong and smart and able to concentrate. I don't want to be fat, sick, and stupid. Okay, so I don't have any desire for it. And what I'm also trying to get here is if you have an attitude of this sucks, I have to eat this boring diet, my life sucks, I'm so miserable, you're going to have a hard time complying with the diet. You're going to want a cheat day or something. If on the other hand, you have the attitude, this is great. All day long, all I do is see all these train wreck patients and they're sad, they're pathetic. And I know that the vast majority of them have zero hope of ever improving, zero, okay? And so I just feel sorry for them. You know, you can cut them open, you can give them some more pills, but they're just crashing and burning. Okay, and so I say to myself, all I got to do is eat this plant-based diet, which I like very much, and I can stay skinny and smart and energetic and strong and not have to take any pills and not be sick like these people, not have to go to hospitals, not have to get cut open for surgery. I'll do it. I'll do it. Thank you, God. Okay. It's a great deal. It's about as good a deal as you're ever going to get. And your Johnson's likely to keep on working into your 70s, maybe 80s. Okay. Where you look at these meat and processed food eaters, I can tell you, I got friends, doctors who are on Viagra, late 30s, early 40s, a lot of them. Okay. It's not good. They say about in the ballpark of in the 30s of age, in the 30s percentile of impotence in a westernized country, in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 50th percentile or higher of impotence, in the 60s, in the 60th percentile, and so to speak. So impotence is super common. Okay. Let's see. Okay, this is a little bit about the details of it. Depends on what your protein level is going to be. Depends on how much beans you're eating. At the time I did this calculation, I was getting about 10.7% of my calories from protein. I would actually like it to be a little lower than that. That was from the beans. I eat more beans on a work day than I do on a non-work day, just because I'm sort of home on a non-work day and I could eat something else if I wanted. But that's something a person could decide for themselves if they want to go lower than that. I'm probably eating more beans than I should, but I always got beans available to me. Okay. I usually have rice, but it's not always there. Anyways, that's about the numbers of it. Okay. And then here is what I call the diet nirvana pyramid. All right. At the bottom level, I call this the paleo, keto, low carb, health hell for morons. Okay. I think it's entirely nonsense. It's just, marketing. Think about it. If you're a big food company, you need to have chumps to buy your product. So there's all these like good looking people. They get all these good looking people and you say, well, gee, that guy, that gal looks good. I want to look like them. I'll do what they're doing. But a lot of times I don't think they're really eating this way long term, right? Because I don't think it'll make them healthy. I think it's nonsense, just so you know. Okay. I think the whole paleo, keto, low carb thing is mostly nonsense. If you got a refractory seizure disorder, eating a ketogenic diet might have a benefit. It'll slow down neuronal function, may decrease your rate of seizures. I would actually think they should spend more time looking at excitotoxins and try to remove the excitotoxins from their diet, but that's a topic for another day. Okay, the next thing is a SAD diet. And this group, I would say, typically ends up being, sort of cognitively impaired, stupid. They're getting all real fat, unattractive. And I kind of joke, that's the minimum wage proles diet. They drink tap water with all the toxic chemicals in there, and they die kind of early. Then the next step up would be the Mediterranean diet, the pseudo-intellectual ignoramuses like the Harvard faculty. That's a big joke. Don't just take my word for it. Type on the internet, diet recommended, and look at the Harvard nutrition. You'll hear them saying Mediterranean diet, Mediterranean diet, Mediterranean diet. And even they say that for these traumatic brain patients. I think it's completely stupid, just so you know. That's my opinion. Because I think the Mediterranean diet had some merit back in the days of Ansel Keys, 1950s, 1960s, when it was primarily a plant-based diet. But in the modern world, it usually means eat cheese and chicken and wine and fish and olive oil. It almost doesn't forbid anything. It's relatively high in fat. I think it's a real bad diet. Okay. And I think it's like the thing that people say when they want to pretend they know what they're talking about, but they don't actually know what they're talking about. Okay. Lacto-ovo pesco is kind of common amongst a lot of physicians, and it's a step up. They'll get maybe an extra 10 years of health or life compared to, the poor sad diet eater, but not that much. And so anyways, the joke continues. It's kind of mimicking, promotion of a professor at a university to get all the way up to nirvana. Full nirvana is like what we were just talking about, organic only, fruits, veggies, starches. All right. A little bit on fiber. When you eat the fiber, what does fiber do? Fiber pulls water into the stool, so it liquefies it. When your stool is liquid on the right side of the colon, that's what you want. If the stool is dried out and hard, like a typical low fiber eating meat eater, processed food eater, you'll form little dried out stool balls. You can call them appendicitis, fecalith. Lith means stone, so a stone made out of poop. And it will obstruct the appendix at its connection to the cecum, part of the colon, the ascending colon here. And so the mucus glands in the distal appendix, the tip of the appendix, will continue to secrete mucus, but now they can't get past the appendicolith, obstructing their outflow. So the appendix will expand, it'll be painful, then it'll pop, and it spills stool all over the abdomen. So vegan, plant-based eaters, they hardly ever get appendicitis, almost never. I mean, all right, what else? Now you move along the colon, you get down towards here. Here's the sigmoid colon. When you defecate. So if you're eating a plant-based diet, when you defecate, you're going to be pooping out something very much like a cow patty. All right. On the other hand, if you're eating lots of processed food and meat, you're going to be pooping out a very hard stool. It looks like a Tootsie Roll. And when you're pooping out a hard stool, you don't have as much contact with the walls of the rectum, and you have to push a little harder. That tighten up the abdominal muscles to push it out. That's called the Valsalva maneuver, and it generates back pressure. This is the Dennis Burkitt abdominal pressure syndrome theory, okay? He was in charge of all the epidemiology of Africa, about thousands of hospitals back in the 1960s, and he saw the pattern that the person's eating a plant-based diet would virtually never have a problem with diverticulitis, appendicitis, or gallstones versus the Westerners, like the people from England and whatnot. And he was a missionary. He was a Christian missionary to Africa. They, the ones who ate that old Western diet with all the bread and jam and meat and oil and stuff, they had tons of all these diseases. Okay, so anyways, back pressure, straining at the stool, you get a pop in your sigmoid colon, your the wall has little out pouches and bulges called diverticulosis. Occasionally they will pop and then stool is spilled into the abdomen. That's diverticulitis. By the way, in any Western hospital, you'll have like at least one patient admitted every day for diverticulitis. It's super common. Plus, if you look at abdominal CAT scans, you'll see the vast majority of Americans over 50, they've got some diverticuli. All right. The increased abdominal pressure also pushes backward on the veins in the rectum, and you'll have a tendency towards rectal hemorrhoids. The increased abdominal pressure will predispose to inguinal hernias, like a little loop of bowel pushing down here. You also get tons of fat hernias. I see mesenteric fat hernias every day. I see multiple of them. Okay, you'll get back pressure down into the veins of the legs, and that causes varicose veins. So, you know, a lot of people are kind of curious to realize that just so being constipated can cause varicose veins in your leg. The other thing is it causes back pressure on the veins that go down into the scrotum, and that will dilate the veins in the scrotum. You get a varicocele, and that increases the temperature of the scrotum, and it can cause infertility. So, because like young guys look at me, they go, "Are you telling me constipation can make me infertile?" And I'm like, actually, yes, it can. Okay, back pressure on the upper part of the stomach can get the top of the stomach to pouch into the chest. That's called a hiatal hernia, because this is the esophageal hiatus, means hole, and so it pops up into the chest, hiatal hernia. And then you'll get acid reflux from the stomach into the hiatal hernia. We call it HH, and that will cause damage to the lining of the stomach, the mucosa. And typically, it'll initially be what's called a Barrett's esophagus. It's like a metaplasia, unfavorable transformation of the lining cells, the mucosa, and that will predispose to increased risk of esophageal cancer. And it used to be like when I was a young guy, medical student, smoker drinker cancer, squamous cell cancer was the most common esophageal. Nowadays, with all these fat gastroesophageal reflux patients, GERD is gastroesophageal reflux disease, adenocarcinoma due to this metaplasia, Barrett's metaplasia, is the most common type of esophageal cancer. Okay, and I see plenty of esophageal cancer. And the same diet causes stones. The vast majority of stones, about 95%, are cholesterol gallstones. So the same high meat, high animal protein diet predisposes to gallstone formation. So it's pretty common. I'll even just call it, that's a Western abdomen. I'll see all this stuff. And the same people have a lot of atherosclerotic ischemic neurodegeneration of their spines. I don't have room on this picture to include all that, but it's all bad and it's simple. What do? Eat your fiber, eat your low-fat plant diet, okay? You don't get this stuff. Okay, another thing, I got a little, this is more advanced knowledge right here now that practically nobody knows this. None of my doctor friends know this, okay? It's the fiber that protects you from leaky gut, because the bacteria in your colon, they take that fiber and they convert it into short-chain fatty acids. All right, you'll often see it abbreviated just like that, SCFA, short-chain fatty acids. There's 2-carbon acetate, 3-carbon propionate, and there's a 4-carbon butyrate. The 4-carbon butyrate is the most important one to know about. The 4-carbon butyrate is taken by the colon lining cells, and they use that to make their tight junctions. So they're real tight between the cells. So imagine that this is the tight junction, the orange thing in between the adjacent cells. And that prevents things you don't want from getting across your intestinal barrier. It's only 1 cell thick. And if you get gaps in your junction, like you don't eat enough fiber, you do other things that are potentially toxic to your intestinal bacterial flora. Like let's say you're taking a lot of antibiotics on a chronic continuous basis. Let's say you're drinking a lot of alcohol. That's toxic to your gut flora. Let's say you're eating a really high fat diet with almost no fiber. Then they don't get the fiber. So now the sort of the bad bacteria take over, if you will, and they will eat the mucosal. They would eat the mucus secretions, they'll eat the mucosal lining of the gut, and you'll get leaky gut. Okay, other things that do it, the chlorinated water, the F- water, the cooking oils, all of that stuff is bad for your gut flora. Okay, so anyways, what happens? The bacteria release these endotoxins. So here's a gram-negative bacteria, and they release LPS. That's lipopolysaccharide. That's the gram-negative endotoxin. Gram-positive bacteria also have an endotoxin. It's called LTA, lipoteichoic acid. Both of those things will get into your blood, and they are bad. You'll also get bacterial, even with big gaps between your cells. You'll absorb bacteria into your blood, and those will often sit dormant until there's a time of free iron, and then they'll become reactivated. But what I want to show you here, because this is a super important thing and doctors don't notice, I teach other doctors. I have a very good sense of what other doctors know. I teach all different age groups, okay? And so what happens is, here's your normal fibrinogen. It's a blood clotting protein. You can see the hydrogen bonds are located within the molecule. So those are called intra as inside of one molecule, all right? What happens, and that's called a beta-pleated sheet. So beta-pleated sheet's like looking through a telescope. It's cylindrical. On the other hand, what happens is when you have this bacterial endotoxins, they will then change the structure of the fibrinogen and make it kind of flat. And this is, in terms of secondary protein structure, what you'll learn, students learn this in biochemistry class in college, okay? Alpha helix is one secondary protein structure. The other one is beta-pleated sheet being flat. The beta-pleated sheet will stack up like a stack of cards, and you can stack up a whole bunch of them. And now the hydrogen bonds are between molecules. So these are inter means between, intermolecular hydrogen bonds. And the bigger a molecule, the more likely it is to precipitate out of aqueous solution. The body is an aqueous solution of water. Okay, so when they precipitate, they can form clots. And why am I going through this? Because it's super important, all right? They form a unique type of clot. Instead of forming clots off the alpha helix structure, they will form clots off these beta-soluble, beta-pleated sheet insoluble precipitates. And this is called amyloid. When you take a protein and you change it from alpha helix to beta-pleated sheet, it's called an amyloid transformation of the protein. And so these are amyloidogenic blood clots. Sometimes they call them fibrinoid. And I tell you all this because they've also been referred to under electron microscopy as dense matter deposits. I'm going to show you the two researchers who did a lot of this work in a moment, Douglas Kell and Etheresia Pretorius. But the relevance is this forms clots that are hard for your body to dissolve. And these little clots travel around your body and they plug things up. They can plug up arteries in your heart and contribute to microvascular angina, like coronary syndrome X, where they plug up the intramuscular arteries, the ones you can only see at a cardiac cath, for example, the epicardial coronaries, the big outer ones that sit on top of the heart. You can't see the little branches inside the muscles. Those can get plugged up by these microclots. I can also tell you infections will do this. Bacterial infections can cause these amyloid clots. Viral infections can cause these amyloid clots, and that is very common. Okay, it can also cause brain damage because these little tiny clots can plug up capillaries in your brain. You don't want to make a habit out of this, okay? You don't want leaky gut. It's a big deal. Besides causing all the autoimmune disease because of, molecular mimicry, autoantibodies, cross-reactivity, and all that stuff. I have an entire lectures with Chef AJ on autoimmune diseases. All right. What I'm going to just give you right now is another metaphor for health. And the metaphor here is that it's a little bit like the video game Super Mario Brothers, and like any video game. Usually the characters running through some environment, which is kind of like an obstacle course. And if they do something good, they get rewarded for it. They get extra energy points. If they do something bad, then they get, a smackdown in their energy points. And so what I'm saying is, this is kind of how it is for us. You eat your healthy food, you get the benefits from that. You get your sleep, you get the benefits from that. You do your exercise, you get along with people, you manage your stress. All the good things, they sort of empower you. They increase your resilience, your physiologic reserve. You do the bad stuff. You stay out late, you get drunk, all of those things knock you down a bit. And so what I often see is people with diseases and problems, and I give them advice, and they only sort of do it halfway. So let's say your body has the potential to heal 3 steps each day. 1, 2, 3. Well, if you're still drinking alcohol, smoking a cigarette, eating caffeine, knock down, knock down, knock down, and you'll never be able to keep those 3 steps each day. So you get nowhere. And then they're kind of frustrated and sad. I tried your diet. I tried this thing. It didn't work. And I'm like, and they just slowly go downhill and do poorly. So what I'm saying is you want to go all the way. You want to think biblically. And, just like telling an alcoholic, you don't tell an alcoholic you can drink on, you tell them you don't drink anymore. No more drink, not one sip, okay? You tell a smoker you don't smoke anymore, not one puff, all right? And you should tell somebody if you want to be healthy, go all out. No animal products, not one drop of oil, none, 0. That gives you the best chance to keep all of those 3 steps, or at least keep 2 of them each day. And if you do that for a month, you'll notice some significant progress. Okay, so here is the hematocrit, the number of red blood cells. You got tons of red blood cells compared to everything else in your blood. You got about 700 red blood cells for every white blood cell. Okay, so that's the main thing that determines your blood viscosity, your blood thickness. All right, and the higher your hematocrit, the thicker your blood is going to be. And I think this is the reason why women live longer. Because a woman, premenopausal woman, she's menstruating every month. When she menstruates, she loses some blood, and that lowers her hematocrit. Hematocrit is the percentage of your blood that's due to red blood cells. Okay, so a woman has a lower hematocrit premenopausal because she's bleeding a little bit every month. Consider that a therapeutic phlebotomy, like a blood draw. Okay. The other relevance is when red blood cells first come out of the bone marrow, they're more deformable. Their outer surface is more flexible. Typical RBC is about 7 microns. The capillary is about 5 microns. So what that means is the red blood cell can't just go right through the capillary. It has to deform itself to fit through the capillary. And so it has to be flexible. The older a red blood cell gets, typically they die at about 120 days. The spleen is like the graveyard for red blood cells. And the reason is these capillaries all through the body are about 5 microns in general. The splenic capillaries, they're about 3 microns, harder to get through. Plus, there's also something happening in the outer plasma membrane of a red blood cells. You typically have what is called phosphatidylserine. It's a phospholipid that's on the inner leaflet, and it flips into the outer leaflet. The older that red blood cell gets, the more phosphatidylserine is flipping into the outer leaflet. I'll show you a picture of this in just a little bit. The relevance being is that not only makes the red blood cell stiffer, some people even think it's an eat me sign for the macrophages to just gobble up that red blood cell in the spleen. Okay, so the point I wanted to make was I was telling you that's why women live longer. Okay, they got more flexible red blood cells and they have a lower hematocrit, and that lowers their blood pressure, and having a lower blood pressure protects you from all these problems. Okay, here's a red blood cell, and on its outer surface it has a negative charge. The negative charge is called the Zeta potential. And by the way, this has been known for a long time because they have to bank blood and store it, and they have to know this to store the blood. But I can tell you this, I've never in my entire life learned this I've never in my entire life met a single doctor who's ever heard of the Zeta potential, other than the guys I know who do research on atherosclerosis, okay? And I did a fellowship in Harvard with the emphasis on vascular disease, and I never heard of this, okay? That's how backward the training is. And I used to always think when I was a young guy, I was an imaging-guided surgeon, interventional radiologist, and I had friends that were vascular surgeons. I had friends who were cardiologists and cardiac surgeons. I used to think, we're the doctors who really know atherosclerosis. But I've learned that that's not true. Cardiologists, interventional radiologists, vascular surgeons, and cardiothoracic surgeons, they're mostly what I would call, they think like a plumber. And when I say they think like a plumber, their attitude is the vessel open, yes or no? Do I need to stent it? Do I need to bypass it? Could I get away with an angioplasty, thrombolysis? That's what they're thinking, okay? That's not the secret of understanding atherosclerosis. The secret of understanding atherosclerosis is to think like a pathologist. A pathologist looks at it under a microscope and says, what am I looking at? And if a pathologist doesn't care what the treatment is, if you have a surgeon, the surgeon can't say, well, surgical bypass doesn't work so well. He can't say that. He would get run out of town, okay? Could you imagine a cardiologist who said stents don't work so well? They go, get out of here, okay? They would blackball him from cardiology, okay? So what I'm trying to say is a pathologist, he doesn't care. He doesn't care if you're treated with diet, drugs, stents, surgery. He doesn't care. They look at it in a microscope, and guess what? Atherosclerosis is a blood clot. Once you know that, you can make all kinds of sense out of it, okay? And I've been studying it for 25 years. Trust me, that's the great secret to know. All right, so now we're going to build up from this Zeta potential. Negative charge around the red blood cells. So guess what? When you encounter something like an IgM antibody for an acute infection, that will have positive charges on it. It'll stick the red blood cells together, and it's called a bridging molecule, something that sticks the red blood cells together. And that makes them less able to pass through those capillaries, so blood pressure has to go up. So the IgM antibody in this context is called a bridging molecule. Usually IgGs are too small to do it, like in multiple myeloma. Excuse me, there's a really, really high amount of them, then it can do it to some extent. LDL cholesterol is big enough that it can do this, be a bridging molecule. Uric acid can also be a bridging molecule. And guess what? Fibrinogen can. When you're psychologically stressed out, your acute phase reactant proteins go up, including fibrinogen, and that's why you become more prone to thrombosis. You're vasospasmed, and your blood's thicker, and you've got more fat in your blood, and you got more fibrinogen in your blood. Okay, here's another test tube of blood. And this reminds me of the movie. You ever saw the movie Game Changers about the benefit of vegan diet for athletes? They showed a bunch of athletes had their blood drawn after a high-fat meal, and it makes the plasma component. So by the way, this is the red blood cells down here. This is where the white blood cells are. It's often called the Buffy coat. And here's the plasma. And the plasma is usually relatively translucent. So you got the white blood cells and platelets in here. In the plasma, you got something like the plasma proteins. Like the most common plasma protein is albumin. Next most common is fibrinogen. And then there's some other plasma proteins in smaller amounts. But when you eat the high-fat meal, it becomes opaque. It's hard to see through it there. And then it also is going to make the red blood cells stick together. It makes the blood significantly thicker, increases blood viscosity, which increases blood pressure, and it also decreases oxygen delivery to the tissue. So it's not good. Okay, this is just showing how the red blood cells, because they both got the zeta potential on them, negative charge on the outer surface, they repel each other. And then we are talking about the bridging molecules are things that stick them together, like LDL cholesterol. Also, there's a whole bunch of nonsense lectures on the internet where they try to say, oh, saturated fat's not that bad, cholesterol's not a big deal. That's not true. Okay, it's been well known, and Ansel Keys was a bright guy. He did good research back in the 1950s with 7-country study, and there's been plenty of other studies that show the more higher your total cholesterol, the higher your atherosclerosis risk, and that's good data. William Roberts, the great cardiac pathologist, done tons of research on this as well. And William Roberts made a great point. He did a lot of research on atherosclerosis guy. He says, if you take a herbivore, and humans are herbivore by their physiology, they got flat teeth like a horse, our jaw goes side to side to grind plant foods. If you feed any herbivore a high-fat diet, they all get atherosclerosis. That's what I meant by you don't need a cardiac CT to check. You don't need a carotid intimal media thickening ultrasound to check. You've got it. You've got it. You've got it. So smart thing to do is start treating it. Eat the low-fat vegan diet, okay? Here's the fibrinogen. That's a bridging molecule, and uric acid can also be a bridging molecule. Uric acid can be elevated from eating meat. It's also elevated from eating like fructose. Now, when I say fructose, I don't mean in a fruit where it comes in fiber in a small amount. I'm talking about if you're drinking these boluses with sweetened energy drinks where there's no fiber, you get these rapid bolus of high fructose corn syrup. That's not a good idea. Okay, sialic acid. It's like a glucose with a carboxylic acid attached to it. It's a little more than that, but that's basically what it is. It's got a negative charge on it. The relevance being is the negative charge of the zeta potentials is given by like 3 things. Sialic acids. It's also given by cholesterol sulfates. Here's a cholesterol sulfate. And it's also given by the heparin sulfates of the endothelial glycocalyx, for example. The glycocalyx around all cells. All right, so anyways, that's where your negative charge comes from. This is some work done by Roy Swank. He's a neurologist, did all the great work on multiple sclerosis. He's a Canadian neurologist who then went to Oregon, and then ended up being friends and worked with Dr. McDougall. Dr. McDougall has a very nice video on his website called Blood Sludge, Blood Flow Before and After Eating a Fatty Meal. So earlier on, you kind of get the chylomicrons, and they stick the red blood cells together. Because normally the red blood cells travel independently because of their zeta potentials. But with all that fat, chylomicrons will stick them together, and also then LDL cholesterol will stick them together. And when you're trying to pump, if you pump one red blood cell through a capillary, 7-micron structure through a 5-micron capillary, it takes a little bit of pressure because they're so flexible. But when you got them all stacked together like a triple-decker submarine sandwich, it's harder to push them through these small vessels, so blood pressure has to go up. And in addition, this is decreasing the oxygen delivered to the tissue. Swank came to the conclusion that he thought that the decrease in oxygen delivered to the tissues caused by the blood sludge effect was damaging the blood-brain barrier and was causing tissue hypoxia in the brain. In his opinion, there's papers by Peter Quo, the cardiologist from, Pennsylvania back in the 1950s. There were estimates in his papers of 15 to 20% decrease in oxygen delivery to tissues from a high-fat meal. And Swank in a hamster brain one time measured a 30% drop in oxygen delivered to the brain. They've now tested this both in the eyes of humans, in the sublingual area in humans. The original work, they did it in a hamster's cheek polyps. They've done it with patients intraoperative with the belly opened up and they can look at a vessel. This is just Swank's paper showing that the red blood cells all sticking together. Rouleau means stack of coins in French. Okay, and then blood sludge is kind of a more all-purpose term. All right, so you increase your risk of it clotting. And then after Ansel Keys has shown how bad saturated fat was for predisposing to coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, in the 1960s, there was a big movement towards encouraging people to eat more polyunsaturated fatty acids like the omega-6 cooking oils. And then Ray Rosenman and Meyer Friedman did research whereby they would feed them these diets. And what they found out is the PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acid, would cause even more prolonged blood sludge than did the original saturated fat. So with the sat fat, they would get a peak, from about 4 to 6 hours. And they would also, Quo would measure the patient's lipid levels in the blood every 30 minutes. And he took a bunch of cardiac angina patients. That means people who get chest pain on exertion. And he and there was no intestinal review board, IRB, back in those days. You could get away with doing this. And it's kind of funny because there's really nothing they could do if these patients had a myocardial infarction. They didn't have any catheters, stents, or any of that stuff back in that day. So what I'm saying is, right when they would have peak lipemia at 4 to 6 hours on here, that's when they would tend to get recurrent episodes of chest pain, angina. Okay. And then it would sort of taper off as the sat fat was being cleared from the blood, so to speak. But what I'm saying is, with the unsaturated fats, the PUFAs, they had even a more prolonged elevation of blood lipids and blood sludge effect on the blood. And in fact, the lab workers were getting pissed off because, they came in the morning, start these tests, at 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, and they would have to stay into the evening. And they didn't like that with the PUFA. So what I'm trying to say is, you're not going to solve your vascular disease problems with PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay. In particular, that's talking about omega-6s. Okay, but the omega-3s are a whole other subject. I'm not going to get into that because that's a big subject and people get all emotional about that. I don't pursue them myself, but I know a lot of the arguments for and against them, but I'm not going to get into that. All right. Here's the point I want to make. This negative charge keeping the red blood cells from bumping into each other. It's not just red blood cells. It's also white blood cells. It's also the endothelial glycocalyx, the lining of the endothelial cells. Okay. So the human body, it's brilliant. Okay. It's genius that everything is all designed so it does what it's supposed to do. The endothelial glycocalyx. Glycocalyx is like, imagine you had a hill and there's little trees on it. So the hill is the endothelial cell, the lining cells of the artery, and the trees on top of it are the glycocalyx. All right. They're a combination of protein and sugars. And when I say sugars, just call them, I don't want you to make you think of like dietary sugars. They just have a negative charge in them. It's like a chemical definition of a sugar. All right. Endothelial cells, the most important thing to know is that they make nitric oxide. Nitric oxide has several beneficial effects. It's a gas that diffuses into the blood and it inhibits the platelets from clotting. That's good. You want that. Being a gas, it can also diffuse in the opposite direction into the wall of the artery, and it goes to the smooth muscle cells and it gets them to relax so they're not contracted. That's what you want. Potassium increases the activity of nitric oxide and creates these beneficial effects. Vasodilation, increasing diameter of the artery, and it has an antithrombotic benefit on its beneficial aspect relative to nitric oxide. Okay, so where's the screw job coming in? The screw job is sodium. Sodium is inhibitory towards endothelial nitric oxide, all right? And there's other things happening in endothelial cell, but the most important thing to get is this nitric oxide stuff. I went to Caldwell Esselstyn's course, and I chatted with him, but in the beginning of the course, I was sitting there, and he would talk, and I would say, well, what about this? What about this? And he goes, I'll talk to you later. I'll talk to you later. And I talked to him later, and he goes, Pete, there's nothing beneficial about confusing people. He says, if they understand nitric oxide, they'll follow the diet, and everything will go well for them. If they get all confused and they can't make up their mind what to do, then they won't follow the diet and they won't get good results. So it's best to just keep it simple. And there's some truth in that, but I can't help wanting to know the details myself. All right. So anyways, that's the main point about nitric oxide. And that's the most important thing to know about an endothelial cell. Nitric oxide prevents clotting and it vasodilates. Those are the two things you want. Most people die from clotting, okay? Hardly anybody dies from bleeding. People die from clotting all day long, every day. Here's heparin sulfate. This is part of the endothelial glycocalyx, the coating of the, let's say, the endothelial cells. And look at all these negative charges. There's negative charges, and there's sulfates all over the place. There's tons and tons and tons of sulfates with negative charges on them. And that creates a zeta potential, okay? Here's a drawing in a little more detail. So here is the plasma membrane of the endothelial cell, and then you got these proteins sticking out of it. And their names, like you can call them a proteoglycan, proteo as in protein, glycan as in the so-called sugar carbohydrate component, okay? Non-dietary. This is a physiological structural thing. Okay, and here's these negative charges on the sialic acids, negative charges on the sulfates, on the heparin sulfates, for example, and they will attract some water to them because water can have a dipole in the sense that means partial charges with the hydrogen slightly positively charged, the oxygen slightly negative charged, and it'll attract water to them. Okay, so why am I showing you this? Why does this matter? Because this makes it slippery. The red blood cells have to slide past. They're a little bit bigger, so they touch the walls when they're going through a capillary, and they just slide through because it's very slippery when wet. Okay, so that's how stuff works in the body. And it's actually beautiful. When you study this stuff, you're like, wow, this is beautiful. It's so brilliant and genius. You know, when you take a smart human, you get like the smartest human, and they devote their entire life to studying one thing, they might figure out part of the structure of the endothelial glycocalyx. And that's a human genius who gets a Nobel Prize. Okay, it's so much more complicated and it's so much more magnificent the more closely you look at it. Okay, that I joked a little bit here. I'm going to show you next slide here. This is called the slide of St. Augustine's vision. He had a vision. He was trying to figure out all this complex theological dogma and doctrine, and he was having a very hard time. And he had a vision that a child was by the seaside, and the child was taking spoonfuls of water and putting them into a little hole in the sand that he had dug. And he says to the child, "Why are you doing this?" And the child says, "Well, I'm going to take the water from the sea and I'm going to put all of it into my hole that I'm making." And Augustine says, "Well, that's foolish. You can't do that. You're wasting your time." And he said, "No more than you can try to recreate all of God's works on your own. You don't have the understanding to do that." And I'm kind of kidding here, but what am I getting at? I'm currently reading a book about attempts to treat stroke, about physiology of neurotransmitters. And what I'm getting at is they have done hundreds of research studies trying to diminish the side effects of a stroke and treat a stroke. A stroke is an occlusion of a blood vessel in the brain. And every single one of them failed, except for one where they had a small benefit from giving tissue plasminogen activator to dissolve the blood clots. But I can tell you, having also trained in interventional neuroradiology, that almost never happens. Theoretically, it can be beautiful. An acute stroke, you dissolve the clot or you pull it out with a thrombectomy catheter, that's beautiful. But that almost never happens. I'll see hundreds of strokes in a day because one patient can have a whole bunch of them. I don't mean acute strokes. I mean on their CAT scan, they'll have a whole bunch of old strokes. And I'll see a couple of acute strokes. But what I'm saying is this idea of us as humans, that we are going to reverse strokes and make all these things happen, they've been studying this, back since the 1970s. They can't do it. All right. On the other hand, all we have to do is eat low-fat vegan, do what we're designed to do, and you virtually never have a stroke. What do you get strokes from? From diabetes, from hypertension, and you can get it from AFib too, which is a lot of times due to atherosclerosis. And you prevent all those things with a low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet. So it's sort of like we already know by just doing what we're supposed to how we can prevent a lot of problems. You're kidding yourself if you think science is going to figure out some treatment for it after it's happened anytime soon. I don't see that happening. Okay, so anyways, here's where high blood pressure comes up, hits the median divider. This is the external carotid to the face, internal carotid artery to the brain, common carotid artery as it comes up. Normally, the blood will hit this, and there'll be a little bit of turbulent flow bouncing off the median divider, a little bit of retrograde eddy currents, not that much, okay? But when you have really high blood pressure, it bounces off hard, and you get tons of turbulent flow and a lot of retrograde flow. When there's an excessive amount of retrograde flow, that confuses the endothelium, the lining cells of this artery, and they will start to express prothrombotic molecules, as well as there'll be other things will happen to lead to clots forming here. Decreased nitric oxide, you're going to form clots on the wall, and that is the beginning of atherosclerosis. And this is what happens in the coronary bifurcations all over the place. This is what's happening all over the place. So hypertension is a major risk factor for atherosclerosis. People a lot of times think, oh, it's just high fat. No, they go together. The hypertension and the high fat are synergistic to make atherosclerosis worse. And you form a plaque here. You'll then coat this with circulating endothelial precursor cells, and you'll end up in a steady state of clot formation, clot dissolving. And eventually, as the person gets older and less healthy, they'll be less able to control these things, and they'll start plugging up more arteries and having strokes. Okay, so what happens when you eat a high-fat meal? So here's a normal endothelial cell. Here's the proteoglycan proteins extending up. These little negatives in blue here, in sort of navy blue, those are the negative charges of the endothelial glycocalyx zeta potential. All right. These are some white blood cell and receptors that normally are not visible to the white blood cells floating by or to the red blood cells. Okay. This is how it normally is. And you also have mechanoreceptors up here that sense the direction of flow. Normally, endothelial cells are lined up. They're like spindle-shaped and along the long axis of their main direction of flow. So everything is good. This is normal. These are the tight junctions between endothelial cells. Here's the endothelial cell. There's a nucleus in the endothelial cell. Okay, so what happens when you eat a high-fat meal? When you eat a high-fat meal, this is especially your saturated fat, like from animal foods, it will bind to your white blood cells and it will activate them. Like this is an NP for a neutrophil. The neutrophil will release myeloperoxidase, MPO, and it is very positively charged. The word for that is cationic. Cationic means positively charged. Anionic means negatively charged. These positive charges will bind to the endothelial glycocalyx, and they will cause it to collapse down. When the endothelial glycocalyx collapses down, what happens is now the prothrombotic receptors will bind with the neutrophils, and this can initiate blood clots. And don't get me wrong, People eat lots of fat meals and they usually don't have too much of a problem. A relatively healthy person has a lot of physiologic reserve, but you're creating a lot of extra work for your endothelial cells, and you start to superimpose things on top of that. Vasoconstriction from the sodium, amyloid clots from leaky gut. This problem gets worse and worse. And I can tell you, I look at CT scans, CT angiograms all the time. I also look at MRA angiograms, but CT angiograms give me a little bit more physiologic data for this topic. And I see people with calcifications all the way from their heart, all the way through the aorta, all the way down to their iliac artery bifurcation in the pelvis. I see it in their carotids. I see it in their intracranial vessels. They have bad blood vessels. And it's been said by William Osler, the great internal medicine doctor back in the early 1900s, a man is only as healthy as his arteries are, or he's as old as his arteries are. You want to protect your arterial health. And high-fat meal, in this context, especially sat fat, trans fat, is really bad. But we just showed you that the PUFAs are really bad as well, the omega-6 cooking oils, okay? So all of the glycocalyx is collapsed down and the receptors for the white blood cells are now exposed. Not good. In addition, they've shown that when you eat a high-fat meal, you deform the shape of some of your red blood cells. Some of them tend to be smaller. I'm not sure of the reason for that. Then other ones tend to be distorted in their shape. Acanthocytes, acantho means like a thorn, cyte means cell. They'll get these little projections on the side of them. Echinocyte is a little bit almost like the echinid. It's almost like a porcupine, and they'll have spurs all over the red blood cells. Well, they're going to be less functional when you distort the shape. The red blood cell, its normal shape is perfect. They call it discoid for being flexible and for being good at oxygen transfer to the cells. The more you distort things, the more prone you are to clotting and other problems. Okay. Now, this two right here are a couple of geniuses. This is Douglas Kell from England, and this is Etheresia praetoris. She's from South Africa, and they've done a lot of work on hematology and also its relationship to microbiology and iron chemistry. And what they've shown is when a person has leaky gut, also when they have got high amounts of free iron, that means non-transferrin bound. Transferrin is the blood transporter for iron. Ferritin is the storage protein for iron in cells. And by the way, eating meat or eating processed food where they refine it, so-called fortify with iron, will increase your risk of becoming iron overloaded and eventually having more free iron. It will distort the shape of the red blood cells. And why am I telling you this? Because this increases your risk of ending up with dementia, plugging up little arteries in your brain. It forms these clots that are irregular and they're hard for the body to dissolve. You start plugging up arteries. That's why people die. That's why people become demented, plugging up arteries in their brain. There's more to it than that, but that's a key part of it. So anyway, here's one of their paper, iron dysregulation and dormant microbes as causative agents in impaired blood rheology, blood viscosity and blood flow with clotting related to Alzheimer's type dementia. All right. So the leaky gut and leaky gums, poor dentition. I can tell you when I look at demented brains, almost every single demented case I see, the patient will have cataract surgery on at least one side and the patient will have poor dentition. I virtually always see that. You could just show me a brain and show me that the guy has a cataract surgery and show me he's got bad teeth. And I will tell you, I will bet the history on that requisition for the CAT scan was, patient fell. Okay. Because all these old people fall all the time. And usually when an old person's fallen, it's because they're demented. Yes, sometimes it's for other reasons, but most of the time it's because they're demented. Okay. So old guy fell, hit head. Old guy on blood thinners, fell, hit head. Okay. And so what I'm trying to say is that's the pattern I see for dementia most of the time, more than 9 out of 10. Okay. They're pre-diabetic or diabetic. They're hypertensive, one or both cataract surgery and poor dentition. I almost don't need to look at the films. If you told me that history, I go, the guy's demented. Okay. And this is just showing some of the clots on electron microscopy, and you're going to form dense matted deposits. So a regular clot looks like this. A regular blood clot kind of looks like pieces of spaghetti versus a dense matted deposit. There's all these irregular thickened blobs of clot formation that are much more difficult to dissolve. Okay. And these are also been called amyloidogenic clotting, because we talked about the transformation from cylindrical alpha helices to beta pleated sheet stacking. They're more precipitated out of solution. And this is contributing to dementia. It's contributing to coronary artery disease, congestive heart failure. And I think this is contributing to coronary syndrome X, microvascular angina. So what does that mean, coronary syndrome X? Well, if you're plugging up the intramyocardial arteries, that's not your epicardials. You can't stent those. There's nothing you could do other than, either take your medications, or you could fix your diet to decrease the slow down the rate of clot formation in your blood, prevent your leaky gut, and let your body try to dissolve them as much as possible. Okay. Trust me, this is a big deal. That's why I'm going over this. You want to know this concept of amyloidogenic clotting, because it is a major thing in infections. It's a major issue in infections. Trust me on that one. You'll be amazed. If you actually start reading about this, you go, whoa. Trust me, it's a big deal. Okay, now here's what we were talking about earlier about externalization of phosphatidylserine. So here's the inner leaflet of a plasma membrane, let's say on a red blood cell. And these red ones here are the phosphatidylserines. As the red blood cell gets older, more and more of them will pop into the outer leaflet of the membrane. And that will make the cells stiffer. And it's also thought by some to be an eat me sign when they are in the spleen, when they get too many of them in phosphatidylserines in the outer leaflet, that time for the macrophages to remove them. Being less deformable, they can't pass through the small capillaries in the spleen, 3 microns. Okay, and then here's we'll talk a little bit about diabetes. How am I doing for time?
You have another 40 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. This is a typical diabetic will tell me, it's under control. It's under control. They're taking their pills. And what I'm saying is, instead of having it under control, I would try to cure it. Okay, so the sooner you try to cure it, decrease the fat in your diet, the better chance you have of ever being able to cure it before you become insulin dependent. So this is what's sometimes called the ectopic fat theory, like of Gerald Shulman. And there's been different work. They've known since the 1920s, the J. Shirley Sweeney study that high-fat diet makes you have a diabetic type oral glucose tolerance test. But, then Michael Brownlee, I'll show you Michael Brownlee and Shulman in a second. Let me just explain what's happening. You accumulate fat first in your skeletal muscle, and that causes, after eating, postprandial hyperglycemia. Then you accumulate fat in your liver, and that makes your liver lose its ability to correctly sense the blood glucose level, which confuses the liver. And it's a big deal because the liver's main job, the main reason you have a liver, is to make sure your brain gets enough glucose during fasting, okay? So the liver has to know exactly what the blood glucose level is, and it keeps on releasing glucose into the blood through a process of breaking down stored glycogen, which is a polymer of glucose, or from recreating glucose through what is called gluconeogenesis. It can make glucose out of proteins, for example. All right. And if the glucose can't sense the blood glucose level correctly, it tends to release too much glucose to the blood. So now you're going to have a high blood sugar level even while you're fasting. And as a matter of fact, there's something funny. Nathan Pritikin said, everyone in America is diabetic. Everyone. And they go, what are you talking about? And he said, if you check Americans, he says, typical person fasts overnight, and then they go to the doctor's office in the morning and they get checked for a blood glucose test, the blood glucose level or oral glucose tolerance test. And he goes, and many of them do okay. He says, you check them after dinner, after they ate a high-fat meal, and they're all going to test positive for diabetes. And there was actually a study that showed that that's pretty much right, which I thought was pretty funny. Okay, so anyways, after you've accumulated fat in the liver, you start to accumulate fat in the pancreas. And that accumulation of fat, as it progresses, that will start to damage the beta cells, the ones that make insulin, and the person will lose the ability to make insulin. And then they become an insulin-dependent diabetic. And I can tell you, I look at CAT scans all the time, and it's routine in a type 2 diabetic to just see severe fatty atrophy of the pancreas. Usually they don't even mention in the report, or sometimes they'll say fatty atrophy of the pancreas. Okay, then you get all the secondary complications. The reason why you get secondary complications is skeletal muscle has glucose type 4 transporters that are carefully regulated based on blood glucose levels and insulin levels to take that glucose into the skeletal muscle cell. But there's other cells that are constitutive. And what that means is in the eye, the retina, in the endothelial cells, in the kidney cells, they just take up glucose based on whatever the blood glucose level is. And a transient spike in blood glucose level is not a big deal, but prolonged, constant high blood glucose means too much glucose gets into those cells and it overwhelms their metabolic enzyme system. And it does the same thing that fat does in the acute setting in the muscle. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is that's how you get all these complications, because the retina cells, you get diabetic retinopathy. In the endothelial cells, you get a microvasculopathy. In the kidneys, diabetic nephropathy. In the nerves, peripheral nerves, you get diabetic neuropathy. And they getting their toes amputated. The reason they get their toes amputated is because, I'll go back to it, because when you occlude these little tiny arteries in the foot, you're screwed. Where are you going to bypass to? If you get stenosis in, let's say, the iliac arteries down here, you can do a surgical bypass across them, you could stent them, you could angioplasty them. But when you're down here in the foot, there's nothing to bypass to. You can't plug in a graft distally. You can't put a stent down there. You can't get a balloon down there. You're screwed. Amputation. Okay, here's a guy named Roy Taylor. He's an English physician, and he worked with Gerald Shulman over at Yale. And, together, it was really Shulman, I think, did most of the MRI research, though. But he showed that an early accumulation of fat within a skeletal muscle was the earliest detectable finding of diabetes, all right? He took a bunch of patients and he looked at the amount of fat they had in their liver. And so the yellow in this color-coded MRI here means fat. And let's say you take a person at baseline has 36% of their liver is due to fat. And if you could get these patients to lose about 20 or more pounds, they routinely would drop their liver fat dramatically. And if they were a newly diagnosed diabetic, like here it was, type 2 diabetics, less than 4 years duration of diagnosis, they routinely could drop their blood sugars back down to normal. So this is Roy Taylor. He won the award, the Banting Award in 2012 as the best diabetes researcher in the entire world. He's got lots of videos if you want to check him out online. Really smart guy. Okay. I'm going to show you a little bit about what's insulin sensitivity all about. So normally after you eat a meal, that's called prandial. So right after you eat a meal is the postprandial phase. All right. Insulin, first of all, the pancreas and the liver sense it. And the pancreas senses that elevation of blood glucose. It starts releasing insulin into the blood. Insulin will bind with the skeletal muscle and it says, hey, you need to take this glucose, because normally a large amount of your postprandial blood glucose should go into your skeletal muscles. It's the biggest organ in your body, your muscles, and store it as glycogen. These glucose type 4 transporters are sitting around in the cytoplasm. They get a signal from the insulin receptor that says, hey, get your butts up to the plasma membrane and bring some glucose into the cell. So then these are like channels, and they go into the plasma membrane here, and they let the glucose come into the skeletal muscle cell. So it stores a lot of, it takes this glucose and it stores it as glycogen that it can use at a later time when it needs it. Maybe if it's active, burn some right at that moment. That's normal. Okay, now here's what happens with insulin resistance. Typically, this is going to be because the cell is overwhelmed with an excessive amount of fat that is sensed as overnutrition. You want to know that word, overnutrition. And so the mitochondria says, hey, I'm overwhelmed with fat right now. I cannot deal with any more glucose. Do not bring any more glucose into the cell. And because of that, these glucose type 4 transporters will not be allowed to go up to the plasma membrane. So now this glucose is in the blood and it's just bouncing off the plasma membrane. It can't get in without these glucose type 4 transporters. So the blood level of glucose stays high. So this would be postprandial, high blood glucose, hyperglycemia. Postprandial, hyperglycemia. And that's insulin resistance right there. Okay, so then the question is, well, what's causing it? Why does this happen? As it turns out, when they've researched, these dietary fats, like let's say your saturated fats, they will go across the plasma membrane of the skeletal muscle and they'll just come inside of it. And they will come inside of it in proportion to their concentration in the blood. They tried using all kinds of inhibitors of fatty acid transporters, but it didn't matter. They were just intercalating into the outer leaflet of the plasma membrane, then flipping into the inner leaflet, and then coming into the cytoplasm. So the only way to prevent that is eat less fat. Okay, that's called the fatty acid flip-flop maneuver. Here's the paper reference if anybody wants to look it up. Okay, now here's what happens over time. Here's a normal capillary, and here's the red blood cells. They're traveling in this direction of the arrows. These spindle-shaped cells in the background, those are the endothelial cells. That's the nucleus of endothelial cells. And then the endothelial cells are a single cell thick. Then they've got a basement membrane. Okay, I have that in yellow. Then adjacent to that are the vascular smooth muscle cells. Okay, and what happens is the oxygen from the red blood cell, it passes through the arterial wall, and then it'll travel to the tissue, in this case, a neuron. So I got a lot of blue circles here for oxygen delivery from a normal capillary. With chronic diabetes, though, you get marked thickening of this endothelial basement membrane. With hypertension as well, you're going to get hypertrophy of the vascular smooth muscles. You're also going to get some fibrosis, collagen accumulation in the wall of the artery. And all of this is going to make it harder to deliver oxygen to the tissue. So you can see this is not good. If you don't get enough oxygen to this neuron, it can't make as much ATP, as much energy as it wants. And then I was telling you about my Peter Rogers MD theory of neurovascular uncoupling. You're screwing your neurons because they have a metabolic rate, which they have to meet those demands. And then they have oxygen glucose delivery. What you're doing is chronic diabetes and hypertension, you're progressively dropping the ability to deliver oxygen and glucose to that neuron. And then if you simultaneously screw your neuron over by being sleep deprived, drinking caffeine, eating MSG and aspartame, this gap gets wider and wider between the metabolic rate of that neuron and the oxygen glucose delivery. And then that neuron just goes, screw it. I can't die. I can't live anymore. Screw it. Just recycle me. Psh, dead. Okay. So that's how people lose tons of neurons. You don't want that. If on top of it, you got leaky gut and you're plugging up all these arteries, you got sodium vasoconstricting these arteries, caffeine vasoconstricting these arteries, you're going to make this gap pretty wide pretty often. You don't want to do that. Okay, this is a guy, Michael Brownlee. He wrote the magnificent paper. I almost cried when I read this paper. It was so beautiful. It's called Unifying Theory of Diabetic Complications. I'll show you the actual paper. And here's what's funny about it. If you look it up in PubMed, which is where people look up most research paper, they will not even give you an abstract. this is like top secret information. Nobody wants you to know about this. That's usually what happens is when something really useful has a paper on it that you want to know, that's going to like help empower the pros, you'll get this kind of routine. No abstract. Okay. They should at least give you an abstract. And it doesn't really have that good of an abstract the way it's written, but you can get it. There's like, I think it's diabeticjournals.org. Or the American Diabetic Association, that you can get the paper. You can get the entire paper. And when you read it, it's beautiful. So here's the official name: The Pathobiology of Diabetic Complications, a Unifying Mechanism by Michael Brownlee. Okay. And it's just so brilliant. He's a guy, he was a type 1 diabetic himself. And in order to save his own life, he wanted to understand diabetes. And so he really figured it out better than anyone else in terms of the molecular biology of it. And the most important thing to know was you don't want to eat a high-fat diet. Okay. Here is this guy, Gerald Sheldman. This is from his lecture. It's a brilliant lecture. He was best diabetes researcher in the world in 2018. He won the Banting Award. You can actually watch his lecture online, and it's absolutely brilliant. He was over at Yale. He actually worked together with Roy Taylor for a while, and it's just awesome. You watch the lecture, you're just like, wow, that is great. And you know, the gist of it is, let's say here's normal glucose metabolism. You meet something with some carbohydrate in it. Your pancreas senses the increase in blood glucose, releases insulin. That insulin interacts with the muscle, gets the muscle to take up more glucose. The muscle stores it as glycogen. That's normal. A little bit left over goes to the liver. It stores it as glycogen. That's normal. But when there's too much fat, it messes everything up. All right. Okay. Now, actually, this is kind of a complex slide. I'll just tell you the gist of it, but this is partly why diabetics are so stupid. If I look at patients, like I talk to tons of patients, and I can tell you, the most cognitively slow patients, to the point where it's really sad, are these kidney failure patients on dialysis. They very routinely have severe cognitive impairment. Your obstructive sleep apnea patients are often cognitively impaired, falling asleep in front of you. Okay, but your diabetics then too, all these older diabetics, and lots of patients are diabetic, they have really poor cognitive function. This is one of the reasons. There's multiple reasons I just showed you: thickening of their capillary basement membrane. So they're not oxygenating their brains as well as they should. They also very often have obstructive sleep apnea. But another reason is it's very hard for them to ramp up. Imagine, what's the purpose of a brain? To walk through a forest, or a jungle or a prairie, and to survive. All right. So things happen. All of a sudden you see a bunch of coyotes. Uh-oh, I got to run. Should I fight them? Should I climb a tree? What can I do? Okay. So all of a sudden, man, you better get your act together fast. So what I'm trying to say is the brain has to go from 0 to 60 miles per hour fast. And in order to do that, it has a system whereby the endoplasmic reticulum, which stores calcium, will start pushing calcium into the mitochondria, because that upregulates, increases the amount of all the mitochondrial enzymes. So you can start running Krebs cycle real fast, oxidative phosphorylation, make tons of ATP very quickly. All right. But people used to tell you, if you read some conventional textbook, and by the way, I think all the conventional textbooks are a joke. Okay. I graduated first in my class. I know exactly what's in them. I had 99% on my residency boards and fellowship boards, my residency boards and my med school boards. So I know exactly what I'm talking about when I say the textbooks are a joke. Textbooks will tell you, well, you've got like glucose 1 transporters in the blood-brain barrier. You've got glucose type 3 transporters in the neurons. You've also got glucose type 4 transporters, just like we showed in the skeletal muscle, okay, in your neurons, including your hippocampus. And that's a big deal because that means you're insulin dependent. All right. And what happens is you need to get these glucose type 4 transporters up to that plasma membrane so you can suck in more glucose when you need it in a stressed out moment. And if you can't do that, you're screwed, because the endoplasmic reticulum is pushing calcium into the mitochondrial matrix to upregulate those enzymes. They go, go, go. And like, where's the glucose? Where's the glucose? Come on, man. Where's the glucose? The neuron's screwed. Okay. It can't get the glucose into the cell because of insulin resistance, but the endoplasmic reticulum doesn't seem to know that. And it keeps pushing calcium into the mitochondria, and that mitochondria, excess calcium, can start to precipitate proteins and cause that mitochondria to die. Okay, so you can cause neurons to dysfunction and die from that. So that's another reason why diabetics are so cognitively slow. And this is just sort of like what Michael Brownlee showed, that the excessive dietary fat, especially saturated fat, is inhibiting the electron transport chain of the inner mitochondrial membrane, right around this area between coenzyme Q and complex 3. And then you start leaking electrons. It's like having a traffic jam. Everything goes backwards. Now Krebs cycle is backed up. It's like a traffic jam. Glycolysis is backed up, and all kinds of secondary pathways you don't want start running. Okay, we talked about this already. Oh, here's what I was getting at to those glucose transporters. You got glucose type 4 transporters on there. It's not just GLUT3s, and you got glucose 1 in the blood-brain barrier. And if you can't get these glucose 4 running, you cannot get enough glucose in that neuron. That neuron can't meet its metabolic demands in a high-stress situation. You're kind of screwed. Okay, this is a little bit earlier. We talked about this before. When you eat the Western diet, you overactivate mTOR. You don't want that. You want to be more of like typical hunter-gatherer ancestor. Okay, they exercise a lot. and they're in sort of a maintenance phase. This is where you run what's called the AMPK pathway, and that's what you want. This is sort of get your sleep, be at peace with yourself. Your body's restoring its ATP after you sort of run around and been busy exercising during the day, rather than saying grow, 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 and potentially speeding up cancer growth. Okay, this just was one brief slide on fructose. When glucose comes into the cell, glucose, the liver is real smart with glucose. It goes, okay, I got plenty of glucose, plenty of energy. I'm going to store this glucose as glycogen. Oh, I need energy. Okay, I'm going to burn this glucose to make ATP. So it knows what to do with glucose, but it gets confused when you have a giant bolus of high fructose corn syrup coming up from a soda pop, rapidly absorbed because there's no fiber in it when you're drinking a excessively high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage. Okay, so what ends up happening is the fructose enters glycolytic cycle at the 3-carbon phase. Glucose is a 6-carbon sugar, fructose is a 6-carbon sugar, but glycolysis splits it in half, and the beginning of it, the 6-carbon phase, is tightly regulated. This is PFK, phosphofructokinase. But once you get to the 3-carbon phase, it just runs to the end. It's not well regulated at all. So the point I'm making is fructose comes all up through the portal vein after you eat, and almost all of it goes in the liver, and it's converted to 3-carbon structures before it hits glycolysis, and almost all of it runs real fast on the second half of glycolysis. And the liver's like, hey, where'd this come from? I don't have anything to do with this. Make it into fat. And so it predisposes to fatty liver. So eating those processed foods with lots of high fructose corn syrup predisposes to fatty liver. You don't get so much of that with fruit, because fruit, there's lots of fiber and other nutrients. It slows down the absorption, and there's relatively small amounts of fructose in fruits in comparison. Okay. All right. Now here's just showing some normal variants. Like this is up in the brain. This is called the circle of Willis. And the point I'm saying is, in a normal adult, you got small posterior communicating arteries in terms of their connection to the posterior circulation for like the occipital lobes and the brainstem and the cerebellum and all that. But you'll sometimes get persistent fetal dilated PCOMs, posterior communicating arteries, in which case you'll get compensatory hypoplasia of the basilar. So what am I saying here? What I'm saying is, some people normally have a small basilar artery sitting on the brainstem. I think my next slide will show that. So here's your brainstem. This artery is really tiny. So when it's tiny, you're going to accumulate atherosclerosis along that wall. Well, guess what? A little tiny artery doesn't have much reserve space. And there's all these perforating branches that go to the pons and the cerebellum. And if you have the typical Western diet, you're going to start occluding those perforating branches, and you're going to get strokes of your brainstem and your cerebellum. I see these every day. Okay. Pop, all these little white spots. These are strokes. Pop, 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 pop. Yeah, this is more than I usually see. I very often see little brainstem strokes, and I'll see a couple of lacunar infarctions in the cerebellum. So what I'm saying is, you don't know if you got that anatomy. You, me, any of us could have bilateral persistent fetals with a, associated hypoplastic vertebrobasilar system. And so we could be at increased risk for this. So you might as well assume you got it and live accordingly and just be healthy. Okay. You don't know what your baseline anatomy is. There's also what I would call the Goldilocks concept here. Goldilocks wants to be, not too much. When she ate the bear's oatmeal, this one's too hot, this one's too cold, this one's just right. Okay, so what am I getting at with hypertension? If your pressure's too high, you can shear off one of these lenticulostriate arteries right here. Here's the internal carotid artery, comes up in the brain. Here's the middle cerebral artery here. These are lenticulostriates going to the basal ganglia. You can shear off one of these lenticulostriates and have a hemorrhagic lacunar infarction. I see those every day. I see a bunch of them. All right. On the other hand, if you have atherosclerosis within these small penetrating branches up high, why do you think you have a blood pressure? It's to get blood to the top of your brain. Okay, you're going against gravity. The hardest spot in the world to pump blood to is to your brain, and actually right in this area right here where I put the skull and crossbones. So if you got baseline disease in these vessels from diabetes, from hypertension, and you overtreat hypertension, you can not get enough blood to these areas. And just from that progressive atherosclerotic disease from hypertension and diabetes, you can occlude these vessels. And I'll see tons of strokes in here, tons of them. A single patient can have over 100 of them, okay? And they just keep slowing down. They don't necessarily become hemiplegic, not until later, but they start slowing down. They start falling all the time. Okay, so here's a typical brain MRI I would look at. You show me this brain, I would say, this looks like typical 75 to 80-year-old. Don't get me wrong. I see all these white spots are little strokes. I very often see people have a clean brain with no strokes at all, but I'm telling you, this is routine. And also I would call this sort of mild to moderate atrophy. Not that bad actually for a 75-year-old. This is widening of the sulci, cerebral spinal fluid filled spaces around the periphery of the brain. This is a flare sequence, which is really like a fat suppressed T2 sequence. So anyways, the typical dictation macro for brain MRI would be this way I would call it extensive periventricular and juxtaventricular. Juxta means touching, like yoke, and subcortical flare hyperintensities, most likely due to chronic small vessel atherosclerotic disease. That's how we usually dictate those cases. And then we'll get into the ejaculatory theory, the mouse equivalents. He would tie off the carotid artery in mice And he found that middle-aged and older mice were typically demented 2 months later. And he came to the conclusion after testing this in various ways that what's happening is chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. And there's a whole bunch of other things that cause it, and I call them mouse equivalents. And at first, when I thought about this, like, oh, is this really a big deal? You know, not many people have complete occlusions of their carotid. I see some, but not that many. But then Dietary pointed out, I'm like, he's right. He says, let's say you're hypertensive and you overtreat the hypertension. You're like the mouse. Let's say the hypertension chronically destroys the vessels in the brain. You end up with the equivalent, and diabetes as well, cerebral hypoperfusion. And then I thought, well, gee, obstructive sleep apnea. I see people dropping their stats into the 60s at night. Let's say you have a diabetic and they overtreat themselves because they didn't used to check their insulin at night. Now they got continuous glucose monitors. They can check it at night, and they're hypoglycemic at night. They can be chronically hypoglycemic. Okay. Aortic stenosis, aortic regurg, chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. Lots of people got atrial fibrillation. They're losing that atrial kick, atrial filling of the ventricles. Chronic cerebral hypoperfusion, congestive heart failure. The heart's not pumping hard enough. Chronic cerebral hypoperfusion. Okay. Sometimes severe anemia can be something similar. All right, so that's the Jack Dietary theory of dementia, and I think that's a great way to understand dementia. I think that's one of the best theories, and the other best one, of course, is mine. Here's my theory of dementia. Normally, you've got neurovascular coupling. MR stands for metabolic rate. I abbreviated glucose and oxygen delivery, GOD, a little bit of a joke. I could have called it OGD, but I called it GOD just for fun. Okay, so the point I'm saying is, if you do something that decreases glucose and oxygen delivery from all these things like the Dietary examples, fine. Okay, but then it turns out also, you can't make as much energy if you have mitochondrial inhibitors. You can't handle your calcium as well if you have inhibitors of SERCA, sarcoplasmic endoplasmic reticulum calcium ATPase. All right. If you have other things in here, they're going to screw up your energy production. Excessive iron, you're iron overloaded. If you have excessive amounts of peroxynitrite, we'll talk about that. So anyways, as you start to widen the gap between the metabolic rate of the neuron and the glucose and oxygen delivery, you run the risk of causing neuronal dysfunction or even neuronal death. And this is what I was getting at with all these stimulants. Psychological stress is a stimulant because the cortisol causes increased glutamate transmission across the synapses. That's a neurotransmitter. Well, guess what? MSG can do that. Manufactured free glutamate can do that. Sleep deprivation does the same thing. Caffeine does the same thing. All of these things are ramping up. They're stimulants. Tobacco does similar effect. Amphetamines, another stimulant. ADHD meds, another stimulant. So you're increasing your metabolic rate of your neuron. Well, you better be able to compensate and increase your glucose and oxygen delivery. You're going to make life very difficult for that neuron. Okay. The beta amyloid polymer will do that. Glyphosate, the glycine component, glycine phosphate, that can also bind the NMDA receptor for glutamate and cause a bit of an excitotoxic effect. We talk about EMF having an effect. And then also I figured, I better understand mitochondrial inhibitors better. So I looked at all my old biochemistry books from college and med school, nothing about mitochondrial inhibitors. So then I started going through the literature. I quickly found over 50 of them. Okay. And that's a very typical thing. All right. So when that gap gets too wide, neuron dies. He says, I can't meet my energy demands, goes into apoptosis. Okay. That's a little more detail. We don't need to go into that. Here's the hippocampi. That's the memory center in the brain. And that's very sensitive because it burns through tons of oxygen. Hippocampal neurons got thousands of connections to stuff all over the brain. They form your memory. They send your memory information out to other neurons, and they need tons of energy. This was just about sodium. We've talked about this before. If you eat too much salt, you dissipate these membrane voltage gradients, and then you can't pump calcium out of the cell too well. And that's related to causing hypertension. It also is related to decreased neuron function. We don't really have much time to go into all that today, but I've talked about it in my previous lectures with Chef AJ. My last one, I went into great detail about it. Okay, this is just my slide of mitochondrial inhibitors. And I thought this was kind of funny that there's none of this in the college textbooks of biochemistry, all right? Or in the medical school textbooks of biochemistry. And I own a bunch of them. I own like 5 of them, okay? So I look pretty careful. And then when I start looking at literature, I find over 50 of them real fast. These are a big deal because they decrease your ability to produce energy. If you can't produce energy, your cell can't do all the things it's supposed to do. And if it really gets a bad gap, like we spoke about, the cell dies, goes into apoptosis. And lots of these things are common. Atrazine, that's spread in all the corn. Okay. F-, that's in your water. Okay. HNE from the omegas, that's the hydroxynonenal, also toxic aldehyde, metabolic product of lipid peroxidation from omega-6 cooking oils. Hypoxia for all these different reasons, like we were just talking about, from diabetes, from hypertension, high-fat meals. Okay. All these things predispose to mitochondrial dysfunction, so it can't make ATPs. Common things. Look at these medications in here. You know these medications. You'll know all these medications, okay? Lots of psych medicines do it, okay? Antifungals do it. A lot of them do. All right, there's tons of antifungals in personal care products and a lot of foods. They prevent mold growing. Corporations don't want mold growing in their foods or their personal care products because people return it. People are disgusted by it. Well, guess what? It also inhibits your mitochondria. You rub that stuff on yourself, you eat it. Okay, so there's tons of them. Okay, so I was rather amused at it. All these things, they make worse, they worsen, they exacerbate excitotoxicity, causing loss of brain cells. All right, so this is a little bit mean. I was saying that basically, you know, I saw a cartoon making fun of a witch doctor when I was a kid, saying, "Ah, silly witch doctor with a magic potion." Well, what is that when you go to internal medicine? I'm going to give you a magic pill is going to fix your problem. And I was getting at it kind of like that last slide I showed of St. Augustine. And, you know, the little kid said to him, "Who are you to think you can recreate God's job?" And what I'm saying is, we've already been given a way to avoid all these problems as much as possible, the strokes and all this stuff, optimize cognitive function. We can just do what we already know, because this guy, Matt Madsen, he's a brilliant researcher, potential future Nobel Prize guy. And he spent his whole life trying to do stroke treatments. And he said they never could come up with anything, you know, in 45 years. All right. Except for TPA, which only works a tiny bit. Good luck reversing a stroke with that. The patient has to have the perfect stroke, come in at the perfect time, have the perfect management, and maybe you'll do it. And 1 year at my whole endovascular fellowship case, in the entire year, we did one case, maybe 1.5 cases, you could say, where there was a good outcome. All right. It's not often that you even get the patient on the table and then to have a good outcome, all things considered. It's not easy. Don't get me wrong. I think it's a good thing to do in the right circumstances, but it's hard to get the right circumstances. There's tons of little tiny strokes that happen initially. They're asymptomatic. Like you look at cerebral microbleeds with cerebral amyloid angiopathy. I'll see tons of those every day. You know, those patients don't overcome, and I think they're initially asymptomatic. Okay, people become iron overloaded, men by their 20s because they stop growing, women after they're postmenopausal. Oh, this is just a little bit, I don't need to get into that. That's Plato's cave. Once you know this, if you're interested in the way I teach, this is one of my books, if you care. Okay, this is just showing the balance for oxidative stress. If you got more antioxidants and things like your vitamin C and whatnot than you do oxidants, you won't have oxidative stress. But if you get more of this than this, then you got oxidative stress, and that damages tissue. Okay, antioxidants come from plants because animals like us, we go, man, it's too hot. We go run in the shade and we protect ourselves from the excessive energy of the sun. The plants can't go anywhere. So the plants have to manufacture the chemicals, the antioxidants themselves, to protect themselves from the excessive energy from the sun. When we eat the plants, we get them. When we eat an animal, it's already used them up, so you don't get much from an animal. Oh, I was then going to talk briefly about soy. We've talked about it before. What I basically said was, this lady right here, she has a very good reason for having a lot of estrogen. Her secondary characteristics, the breast, the Virginia, they're all well developed from her estrogen. A soy plant does not have any breasts. It does not have a Virginia. Why does it have thousands of times more estrogen than does other plants? And also, flax has sky-high estrogens. That's another reason why, even though I hear all kinds of great things about it, I haven't studied it in great detail. I'm not a fan of that stuff, because to me, it sounds like a way to make the animal that eats it infertile, potentially. All right, lots of guys are estrogen overloaded with big bellies. They got moobs, man boobs, etc. And what I'm trying to say is, there's a lot of people who can't lose the weight, and they don't know why they're so fat. And what I'm saying is, I think a lot of this fatness is due to the estrogenic chemicals in the food and in the water, and also potentially because the Tetsumori Yamashima's claimed that eating the omega-6 cooking oil leads to lipid peroxidation that damages the hypothalamic hunger center in their brain, so then less able to regulate their appetites. So here's cholesterol. It's 4 rings. Here's the A ring you need to know about, and here's the A ring in an estrogenic hormone, estradiol, for example. And what happens is you got a hydroxyl group here, also called an alcohol group, coming off the benzene ring, because there's 3 double bonds. It's an aromatic ring. This is what binds the estrogen receptor. Okay, so here it is binding to the estrogen receptor. You form a hydrogen bond with the receptor right here. Anything that's got this structure here with a phenol group, meaning in this like a benzene ring with a hydroxyl group on it, will activate that estrogen receptor. And there's tons of chemicals that do that. Bisphenol A, here is the phenol group, benzene ring, hydroxyl group. And then people say, oh, well, there's so many complications from bisphenol A. Can't you get rid of it? Company goes, yeah, sure, I'll make you happy. They just put a sulfate in the middle. It's the same thing, does the same thing pretty much. So the corporations are always going to make that stuff because it's so profitable for them. When you eat meat, you change the gut flora. The gut flora from eating meat and processed food has more of an enzyme called glucuronidase. So normally the body regulates excess estrogen by conjugating in the liver, makes it more soluble in the bile. It's excreted into the bile from the liver into the bile, goes into our gut, and we poop it out. So you defecate out your excess estrogen. But if you've got the bad gut flora from a meat and processed food diet, you will deconjugate it. You will clip off the glucuronic acid. You remember, glucuronic acid is just a glucose with a carboxylic acid on it, essentially. Okay, so what happens is you'll then reabsorb the estrogen. So meat and processed food eaters, due to their lack of dietary fiber and the bad gut flora, they just reabsorb their estrogen. They got high estrogen levels, and that's why they end up being much more likely to get fibroid tumors, much more likely to get breast cancer, I've known women who told me every single woman in their family had to get a hysterectomy before the age of 35 because they all had lots of fibroids. Okay, and then on the corn, the non-organic corn, they spray this stuff atrazine. It actually turns the male frogs into female frogs. I won't even tell you what was in that paper. It's disgusting. Okay. Anyways, and then I was going to talk a little bit briefly. I said that, my mother taught me so many good things. My mother was not a scholar, but she was like a saint, and she taught me all kinds of good things. This right here is a conversion of St. Augustine, where he sort of realized a lot of his previous educational stuff, there were better things for him. And what am I getting at? I was shocked. If you would have told me, a guy coming out of Stanford, Harvard, and my dad was a doctor, that conventional medicine was wrong about a lot of things, I would have thought you're an idiot. We always look down with scorn upon things like chiropractor, nonsense, homeopathy, that's nonsense, nutrition and all that stuff, that's nonsense. And all of a sudden I realized, I was fat in my 30s. Both my parents were sick. I realized this nutrition and toxicology is more powerful than conventional medicine for most things, for all the common diseases. Okay. And then, I'm kind of old and I'm kind of scholarly like he became. And also, things are kind of worse in our current society. And it reminded me, I grew up when America was kind of like this, and it's kind of becoming like this, and it makes me sad. And so, like St. Augustine, what did he say? He wrote the book City of God, and he said a lot of good things. He said, wrong is wrong, even if everyone is doing it. Right is right, even if no one is doing it. So in order to be right, a lot of times you have to do something that's not that popular. And that's why I'll talk about MSG. I'll talk about soy and some other things, even if people don't like it. Too bad. I don't make any money from this. It's not my commercial job. I don't have to be a goody two-shoes and talk in a dopey way like most doctors do, because lots of patients are demented and they have to be polite and they don't want to offend anybody. I don't care. I'll just tell you what I think is correct. And Augustine said, the problem of a response to evil is not to return evil, but to transcend it. The key question is to what use will we put our suffering, and how will you transcend it? So what I'm trying to say is, you look around, the water's got stuff in it that shouldn't be there, aluminum, F-, estrogenics, train tip over, all this stuff, processed foods, it's got all these toxic chemicals in there, the hexene, the atrazine, the HG, the GP, the fruits are even getting screwed up now with the AP. I'm not even going to say that word ends in L. The meat with the atrazine accumulated in these animals, the GP accumulated in these animals, the pesticides, the EDCs, the fake meat, who knows what the heck's in there. The air's got all this stuff in there and all this stuff in there. Conventional medicine, it tries to treat common diseases with things that don't work. So you're kind of on your own. You kind of realize that as you get older, you're on your own. And so what I'm saying is, a lot of things are kind of messed up. And so you just do the best you can, hope for the best, but it's kind of sad and a little bit scary. And I think I end up with something simple. I basically say to myself, what's the best way to overall be kind of healthy and kind of live, I think, like Adam and Eve, but keep our modern indoor heating and plumbing to a large extent. And it's a bit of an oversimplification, but I think that's good. Like if I see some complicated product, I was recently, a friend of mine had me look at his supplements. I said, you don't want me to look at your supplements, because once I start reading all the ingredients, you're not going to want to take them anymore. Are you sure you really want that to happen? And they go, well, you can look at these ones. So I looked at them and they were full of all kinds of things you didn't want. And don't get me wrong, there might be some that are good that I don't know about. But anyways, it is what it is. I hope this lecture was helpful to you. I do find this low fat, low sodium, vegan Spartan diet has worked well for me for many years. I'm 60. I feel full of energy and health. My total cholesterol is like 90 to 120. And anyways, I hope this was helpful to you. That's it.
Dr. Rogers, I think we should rename the show from Nutrition Insights to Dr. Rogers Mini Medical School. What do you think?
Anything you want.
Oh man, I'm having trouble getting this centered. You can see me, right? Would you mind answering a few questions that were sent in advance? Would that be possible?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, fantastic. Okay. There were 3. So thank you guys for sending the questions in advance. Okay, so the first one is from Richard. Let me pull that up. And he says, he's been they're not always on the topic you talk about, just so you know, because people don't always know at first, but he says he's been dealing with swelling of the left knee on and off for a few years. It was a college injury that showed up later after he started getting into running. His diet is very low inflammatory. In fact, his doctor thinks that's why he's not in any pain. If he keeps eating this way, which he intends to do, will that stop the knee from deteriorating further? And what do you think about the science where they inject a protein into a joint that one day may regrow cartilage? Is that in the future for orthopedic medicine?
Well, I don't know how well those are injections going to work. Maybe there is a good future for that, and I wouldn't know about that. But what I would say is just basic stuff. Any tissue in your body, it's going to heal better with good blood supply. And remember, we talked about you have potential to go up, let's say 3 positive steps each day in healing. And so you don't want to knock yourself back down. When you eat animal food, you eat oils and all that stuff, you cause inflammation, you predispose to leaky gut, you predispose to amyloidogenic microclots and all that stuff. So by going low fat, low sodium vegan and avoiding all the negative stuff we talked about, you optimize your chance to get that little bit of healing every day. You do run into the problem that, cartilage is not that well vascularized. So I don't know how much you're going to be able to heal that cartilage, if that's what the problem actually is. But I think that's your best chance. Dr. McDougall wrote a real nice essay years ago called Diet is the Only Hope for Arthritis. And I also had the experience when I was in my fat phase. I used to have terrible back pain. My feet would hurt a lot. I had a peripheral neuropathy. I was almost like hesitant to get out of bed because as soon as my foot touched the ground, it would hurt like crazy. All that stuff went away completely once I became a vegetarian. And then now I'm a vegan. I'm 60 and I'm strong and full of energy. And I've seen that happen in a lot of people. All kinds of little aches and pains go away. That's kind of what I meant too with that joke about the bulls. You can solve a bunch of problems simultaneously if you optimize blood flow throughout your body, and you're also minimizing inflammation, you're increasing your antioxidants and all this other positive stuff.
It's funny when you said if the textbooks are a joke, why don't you rewrite them?
Well, I would love to. I wish I had more time. It's kind of like when I was young, I was very lonely. I didn't know anybody in college at Stanford. And I had this dream. Someday I'll become a great doctor or scientist, and then I'll be popular again, and my life will be fun again. Because I went far away. I was from Chicago. And so I didn't know anybody. And what I'm getting at was now I've sort of like become a really knowledgeable doctor. And it's like that and $1.50 to get you ride on a bus. No one cares. No one cares about all the poor people, all the proles. They don't got any money. You want to make big pharma happy. You want to make the insurance company happy, sell them some drugs, do some surgeries on them. There's the money. So what I'm trying to say is I wish I could get a sponsor because I would love to. I have the ability to rewrite all the textbooks, but no one cares. Individuals ask me to help them and I do what I can to help them. But what I'm trying to say is I wish there was money in this. There isn't, and you can't get even a sponsor. And I've had a lot of papers rejected from journals because I'll come up with a theory, but there's no money in it. I figured out the spinal degeneration theory of ischemia, as well as the way muscles, some of the ligaments change due to certain chemicals. I figured all that stuff out, but the journals won't publish it. All my neuroradiology, neurology, neurosurgery colleagues are like, wow, you're right. But the journals don't want it, unfortunately.
Right. Thank you. This is from Donna in Australia. And she says, Dr. Rogers, I've heard you speak 4 times and I've enjoyed your detailed content immensely. Could you please explain again why we shouldn't even consider drinking coffee?
Well, basically because coffee mimics acute stress. It raises the same hormone. So cortisol is the first hormone, and it also increases the catecholamines. That means adrenaline and noradrenaline. Well, those will increase your blood lipids. You don't want to increase your blood lipids. Those will get you to not sleep as well. You might sleep the same number of hours or less, but you'll tend to not sleep as deeply. It's during sleep when you clean your brain, you refresh yourself. A lot of your healing occurs during sleep. So you've got some problems here. Elevated lipids, you've got decreased sleep. You're going to keep yourself more in a stressed out phase. It tends to make a person a little more anxious, a little more impulsive. They sometimes do things they regret when there's a lot of caffeine on board. They're less able to heal. You excrete more calcium through your kidneys. You increase your risk of kidney stones. You'll sometimes get this afternoon lag. You get a little bit of a buzz in the morning, if you will, to energize you, but you'll often get a little bit of a rebound lag in the afternoon. You'll have a slightly increased risk of rebound hypoglycemia. I think there's a bit of a vasoconstrictor effect to the brain as well. You get a little less blood flow to your cerebral cortex and your hippocampus. Simultaneously, like stress and cortisol, it increases glutamate transmission at the hippocampal neurons. So it can predispose you to excitotoxicity. It's ramping up your metabolic rate. And like I said, it's a vasoconstrictor of the brain. So it's simultaneously dropping your oxygen and glucose delivery a small amount. And you can handle that pretty well when you're young. But the older you get, the more you are at risk to have brain cells going into apoptosis due to a widened gap between metabolic rate and oxygen and glucose delivery. So I would stop fooling around with that. My advice is I remember quit it. And when you quit, like when I quit coffee, I felt sad for about 3 days because I missed my buzz, my drug addiction. And then I had cravings for about 2 weeks. But after that, I was really glad. All my energy came back to normal. And it used to interfere with me. It would interfere with my day. Like, let's say I get a phone call. We have a biopsy waiting for you in this room. I'm like, okay, I'll be right there. But then I'm like, give me 15 minutes. I have to run and get some coffee. And then I'm delaying the case, and they're like, man, you're delaying the case. What's with you? And I go, it's okay. It's nothing. Forget about it. Okay. So I didn't like always, then on a weekend, I would wake up early because I'd have to get my cup of coffee, and I couldn't sleep in. It was having more of a negative effect on my life than I wanted it to. So anyway, because I drank coffee every day, 2 cups a day for about 15 years.
Well, Dr. Rogers, have you read this book yet?
No, I have not read that yet.
Because he recommends that.
Well, I can tell you why I would see that getting recommended. There's so much, the big rich companies, they buy all the journals. Most of the journals are owned by like big food, big pharma companies. And then they publicize favorable papers on their products. There's going to be tons of that. The reason is, for example, they've got billions and billions of dollars. Scientists are poor. And the company basically says, look, you play ball with us, we'll give you ongoing grant money. You don't play ball with us, you don't get no grant money. That's just the way it goes. There's a giant, what I would describe as like a bodyguard of lies around every profitable corporate product. Just how it is.
Great. Oh, and when you were saying about fruit, I eat usually 1 fruit a day, maybe 2. It's not I eat more vegetables and starch than fruit, just so you know. And Sarah would like to know why her husband has a total cholesterol of 280, his LDL direct is 203, and HDL 44. What can he do to avoid going on statins?
Well, he might have a familial hyperlipidemia. So he should probably go to somebody who's pretty experienced in that. He could certainly try the low fat, low sodium vegan diet and see how much that helps him. But he's pretty high up there, and I don't know what his age is, but he might be in, it sounds like he's potentially in a very high risk for myocardial infarction, as well as impotence and stroke and all this other stuff. So some people who are predisposed, they might be more likely to need medication added to it, but it's also been experienced in a limited number of cases that Elston and that Ornish have seen that they said, usually if a patient follows the diet and everything that they recommend, they tend not to have a problem, even though they have a little bit more elevated. But that's not a small elevation. That's a big elevation. Average Americans have got a total cholesterol of around 220. Your target goal is really to keep your total cholesterol below 150. I would say even below 140. So he's pretty far away, that guy. So it might be a little harder for him. And some people can have elevated LPA and stuff, but usually if you follow it closely, even if you got some predisposition, you're usually okay, but there are some exceptions.
Great. Well, Dr. Rogers, as usual, this was very wonderful. Thank you so much for the presentation. I wish you and your family a very happy holiday season.
Thank you.
Great. And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Pacific time for Plant-Based Classics with Lauren Bernick. She's going to be making a creamy vegetable soup and the Jennifer Aniston salad. Take care, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.